This is Cheloniacast, episode 51. Today we are joined by Dr. Russ Mittermeier, who is the Chief Conservation Officer of Rewild. Dr. Mittermeier is a herpetologist, primatologist, conservationist, and really well-known researcher in biodiversity. He's written a co-authored over 45 books and 800 publications in these subjects. He's also a world adventurer in pursuit of animals, cultures, and people. He's visited 169 countries and has really just one of the largest resumes in this area of research and interest out of really anyone. And it's just really incredible. He's described over 21 new species. Early on, we talked to him about it, and he's actually lost count, which is sort of telling. It's really incredible. He's also the past president of Conservation International, where he served for 24 years. He serves as the chair of the IUCN SSC Primate Specialist Group and is also on the executive committee of the IUCN SSC Tortoise and Freshwater Turtle Specialist Group. And through his work with the IUCN, he was appointed a IUCN World Conservation Union member in 2012. He has many different awards for his work in conservation, including the Nobel Prize of Conservation, the Indianapolis Prize, which he received in 2018. He was named one of the Time magazine's Heroes of the Planet, and serves as an adjunct professor at State University of Stony Brook, and also is an associate researcher with the Museum of Comparative Zoology. It's really an incredible list of things. And this is sort of an abridged version, and it's really an honor for us to be able to talk with him today. This has been a long process and interview in the making. And so thank you for joining us. It's really an honor.
Well, great to be with you, and congratulations to you guys on doing this series. It's really terrific.
Thank you.
So, to get things started off, what first got you interested in turtles and tortoises? And did your interest in turtles develop before your interest in primates and global conservation?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I started out as a herpetologist, and as long as I can remember, I've been interested in herps, and particularly turtles and snakes. And the snakes have dropped off a little bit, but that interest in turtles goes back to the earliest days of my childhood. I don't know exactly how it happened. It's just one of those things, Ed Wilson says, there's this tendency to biophilia. Some people just have a connection with animals, specific groups of animals. And I wound up being very interested in herps very, very early on. I mean, some of my close colleagues, like my very good friend Anders Rodin, he came into it much later. I mean, I think Anders got into it probably when he was about 20, got into turtles. But I was there from the beginning.
So that's how it started out. And you grew up in Long Island in New York, which is not necessarily, it's not a biodiversity wilderness hotspot by any means. Looking at older reports, there's certainly a lot of interesting wildlife there and some things. But what was that like? And what were some of the places that sort of shaped your early interest in turtles and wildlife?
Well, I started out in the South Bronx, first 7 years in the Bronx, which is also not a hotbed for biodiversity. Then I moved to Brooklyn for a couple of years. And then at age 9, I moved out to Long Island, Suffolk County, Long Island, the town of North Babylon, which was just, those were the early days of suburbia. And there were still forests out there at that time, but they were getting cleared. And I watched them over the course of my time there. Even in my neighborhood, some patches of forest that had animals in them getting cleared. And that really bothered me a lot. And that kind of instilled in me an early sense of conservation. But further out on Long Island, as you got into the eastern part of Long Island, there were still and still are habitats for wildlife, ponds, rivers. And I would go out there and collect whatever herps I could find, especially turtles, frogs, snakes, salamanders. And I would bring them home. I would keep them in my backyard. And at that time also, I joined the New York Herpetological Society and was one of the founding members of the Long Island Herpetological Society. So I got to meet a lot of people who were involved in herpetology at that time.
That's really interesting. And so some of your earliest publications were about wildlife on a trip to the Smoky Mountains and some other work that was around in New York. Maybe you could expand upon what the excitement of doing your first sort of scientific contribution was. What was that like?
Yeah, for some reason, I always had this desire to publish. I don't know. That was way before getting into the university and the whole publish or perish syndrome. I just always liked the idea of publishing. So after this very short trip with my parents to the Great Smoky Mountains, and then some of these collecting trips out in eastern Long Island, I thought, well, this might be interesting. I might as well publish some of these notes. And I did, the first ones I did in the Long Island Herpetological Society publications, which was basically a mimeographed paper journal. I don't even know how many members we had, maybe a few dozen, maybe even 100. But it was an outlet for publishing, and I said, okay, why not? Let me try it. And then I also became very enamored of the International Turtle and Tortoise Society journal, which was published by a lady in California for the better part of I don't know, maybe about 15 years, and that was a great outlet for publishing. And my first, glossy publications were in that journal, and I still have the entire set in my library, and I value it very highly. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's worth looking at because it really provided an outlet for people who weren't necessarily professional herpetologists, although people like Peter Pritchard did publish there. But it really provided an outlet for us who were very young, but very interested in getting stuff out there to the broader public.
We all spent a period of time helping move the Colonial Research Institute from Florida to California. I think I don't recall specifically if we got into that, because Dr. Pritchard definitely had all of those old copies, but I can't remember if we flipped through those. But it does sound familiar. But yeah, to see that's really interesting. And so you were in close proximity to the Bronx Zoo, which has this really immense history of conservation with John Baylor and even those before him. How did that factor into your sort of developing interest? And also maybe the M&H is also an area that I'm sure you had some experience with.
Well, there were several influences early in my career. One of them was my mother. My parents were German immigrants. They came over in the late 1920s, and my mother was a housewife, but she loved wildlife. So just about every week she would take me to the Bronx Zoo, which was only about 30 blocks from where we lived in the South Bronx. And the American Museum was also quite close. So she would take me out there all the time. And I would always gravitate towards the reptile house and then later the primate house. And just loved seeing these strange creatures. And in my mind, I kind of developed a bucket list of animals that I wanted to see in the wild eventually. Things like the Goliath frog, king cobra, which I still haven't seen in the wild, Komodo dragon, which I have, reticulate python, all of these things. And so that really was an early influence, and that got reinforced through multiple visits. And of course, as you say, the Bronx Zoo does have a long history going back to people like Ray Ditmars, who was the famous early curator of herps at the zoo, wrote a number of really influential books. And then also I was influenced by Wild Kingdom, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, which ran for about 20 years with Marlon Perkins and Jim Fowler. So every Sunday afternoon I would watch College Bowl, which was an old version, an early version of Jeopardy, and Wild Kingdom. And that also kind of reinforced my interest in wildlife. And then the other really, really big interest was Tarzan, right? The Tarzan books, the Tarzan movies, the Tarzan comics, you name it. I got into that very early on, and I read avidly all of the books that were written by Edgar Rice Burroughs. There were something like 24 Tarzan books, but there were also books on Mars, Venus, the moon, Pellucidar, this land with this entire prehistoric world within the bowels of planet Earth. I mean, really cool books. And so that really instilled in me not only a love for wildlife and reinforced my interest in wildlife, but also a sense of adventure. So those were the real strong influences in my early life.
With the sense of adventure is interesting to me because I mean, something about your personality, it's much beyond just herpetology. And, we've spoken to a lot of people that are strictly turtle biologists, but that's certainly not your case. And there's a lot of, I mean, wildlife has been a central part of your career, but there's been so many other things, and the cultural aspect, the adventure aspect, and a lot of different, the human aspect, And so that sense of adventure, I'm really curious, because I think most of us have that do this podcast, and it may have developed separately from our interest in the wildlife. Is that the case with you? Did that come out of watching Tarzan, or where did that come from?
Well, it was all interconnected. I mean, if you're interested in wildlife, a lot of the interesting wildlife is in remote corners of the planet. And, when I was a kid growing up in the 50s and 60s, a lot of places like Amazonia were still largely unknown. And so I really decided early on that I wanted to, first I was interested more in Africa because of Tarzan, but then I also got interested in all of the tropical regions of the world because of the amazing biodiversity that they have within them. So it's all interconnected. I can't say there was a separate track looking at the adventure aspect and another track looking at wildlife. It was all really part of an entire lifestyle, really. So yeah, I mean, it very early on, I decided I wanted to go and visit cool places. And I didn't actually get to the tropics until I was 17. Did a trip to a surfing trip, actually, because I was a surfer in the old days, down to Puerto Rico, and that's where I saw my first rainforest. But my real first serious rainforest experience was when I was 20. So I got started relatively late compared to some of the young people these days. Like my kids, 2 boys, and also my daughter are interested in these subjects, and I started taking them to the tropics when they were like 2 years old.
Right. So that's interesting to think about, just how the different aspects, it's all kind of interrelated for you. It's interesting. And so, as a kid, when we're sort of at this stage now, we're in college, we have access to more resources, and we want to start, traveling places and seeing things, and the stuff that as kids we read about,
Yeah.
and for you in the past, you get to the point where you can do that. You can actually go. So with turtles specifically, what was your first experience abroad with turtles, and how did that shape kind of your path and career?
Well, the first experience with turtles that was significant was in 1970. I did a number of foreign language programs when I was at Dartmouth. And one of them in 1970 was going to Costa Rica to learn Spanish. And we did a field trip during our time there. We went up to Barra del Colorado, which is on the Atlantic coast of Costa Rica, right on the border with Nicaragua, and a little bit to the north of Tortuguero. We also visited Tortuguero, but it wasn't nesting season, so we didn't really see any turtles. But while there, I saw in the river that forms the border between Costa Rica and Nicaragua, I saw Rhinoclemys funaria, which is the biggest of the rhinoclemys, and it's actually a basker, river turtle that basks. And then I asked the local people, I noticed that there were mud turtles running around in puddles under the stilt houses on the coast there. And I said to the local people, oh, why don't you collect some turtles for me? So they went and collected, I guess, about 20 turtles. And all but 2 were Cainosternum leucostomum. And 2 of them were Cainosternum angustipans, which was kind of a weird looking thing. I had no idea what it was. It had only been described a few years earlier by Legler, but it was very distinctive. It had a very narrow plastron and was pretty aggressive. So I brought those back with me. Back in those days, you could carry animals around however you wanted. There was no Endangered Species Act. There was no CITES. So I brought them back, and in 1969, I had met Walter Sachse in Germany, and he was a specialist in Cainosternum. So I sent him some pictures, and he said, "Oh my God, that's Cainosternum angustipans. Can you send them to me?" So I sent them to him, and then a couple of years later, about 4 years later, Anders and I went back to the area in 1974, and we collected another 2 angustipans. And I also sent them to Sachse, and he managed to breed them. He had them for a long time. And actually, one of them is still alive. And after Saxa passed away, I think it passed on to Peter Prashog's collection. So one of those animals that I collected in 1970 is still alive. And I collected it as an adult.
Wow.
So it could have been 5-10 years old already when I first got it. So that's pretty impressive. I actually have a little Kinosternon scorpioides. It's about the only turtle I have left now that I'm keeping. That's 29 years old this year. Those animals live for a long time.
That's really interesting. I got to spend 3 months in Costa Rica last semester for study abroad, and we didn't get to go up to the Barra de Colorado area, but we were mostly on the western coast. But that species we did have a trip for a few days to La Selva, and that's near where the type locality for Angustipons was, and I was just trying to find a way to get out of the group for a few hours to go look, but that wasn't going to be possible. But so you actually, did you see the Angustipons habitat? Was there anything about their ecology that's odd? Just because they're in such a low abundance compared to the others, it's strange.
Yeah, these narrow plastroned Kinosternon, like Kinosternon dunni in Colombia, they're also pretty low density, and who knows why. But yeah, the first habitat I saw them in was rain puddles under houses, elevated houses of the local people. So not exactly an exciting habitat. And then we also found them in some small streams, not far from La Selva, actually, near Puerto Viejo. And it's hard to tell why they're in such low abundance compared to the other sympatric species. But it's something somebody should do a PhD on them sometime, or a master's thesis, just trying to figure out what makes them tick. But to my knowledge, that hasn't happened yet. And they're really, they're very low density, and I think they've been assessed as vulnerable, but I was pushing hard for them to be endangered, because they have started to come out in the trade, and I am a bit concerned about them.
And some of yeah, right. That's I was surprised by how little information there is. There's Legler's description, and then I think that you wrote a note about it, or something. There was something attached to your name, and that seemed to be about it.
Yeah, there are some papers that have come out since, and we've done an account of them in the Chelonian Biology and Conservation, but and there's also been a red list assessment for them. But yeah, not a whole lot has been done on them yet.
How is their detectability? Like, are they really cryptic and tough to find, or like does that contribute to them?
I think that there's not really a big difference between finding them and finding mud turtles. You just set out traps or get local kids to collect them for you. But the habitats are pretty similar to Kinosternon leucostomum.
And so you also did some early publishing on turtles in markets, in Central American markets and such.
Right.
I'm curious, what did you learn? Because some of the most interesting takeaways are found from learning about turtles outside of where they're actually in the wild. So what did you learn through the market surveys, or what was the context for that?
Well, I knew that turtles were consumed as food in some of these areas, especially in places like parts of southern Mexico. But when I went into the markets, I was kind of appalled how many animals were being consumed locally, from Dermatemes to Storotypus to the mud turtles, the sliders, you name it. So I didn't realize, I was 20 years old then. I didn't realize that turtles were being eaten at that level. I mean, growing up, you hear about diamondback terrapins being eaten in New York and snapping turtles. But boy, when I saw the extent of the trade in Central America, I was pretty shocked. So, and now we know so much more about the consumption of turtles in other parts of the world, particularly in Asia, but really all over the place. So that was an early warning call for me that, hey, these animals are not all of the people in the world regard them as wonderful animals to study and keep, but rather as a food source.
Has the situation in terms of the markets in a lot of those places, has that changed? Because in some areas, Costa Rica at least seems like, I'm curious what your opinion on this is, how well that area has changed in the course of you've seen it from a conservation standpoint. Has the hunting for turtles, has that subsided a bit for alternatives, or has it not really changed much?
Depends on the country. Costa Rica is exceptional, but Costa Rica is really a gem. Other parts of Central America, they're still being consumed, and obviously in Africa and Asia, and in the Amazon, for example, the Podocnemus river turtles are still heavily exploited. They're protected to some extent by the fact that it's technically illegal, and the Amazon is so vast. But even the big Amazon river turtles like Podocnemus expansa, they're still consumed. It's mainly a black market trade, but it's quite prevalent.
Right. And so one thing that stood out to me too is you wrote a note about Rhinoclemys annulata, the brownwood turtle. And this was one I had a weird experience with this while I was in Costa Rica. The area we were in was on the west coast in a mountain range, the Tiburon Mountains. And they had not, all the local people there, I'd asked them a lot about those turtles, and no one seemed to had seen one. And they'd seen one, but it was on the opposite coast. And midway through the stay there, one of the people that worked at the station we were at brought one to the office and said they found it crossing the road. And so I sent a photo of it to Anders and talked to him about it. And it turns out that they were writing the species account for it, and it was going to be published in 2 weeks. And so they added that record, which happened to not be recorded. So it was kind of a crazy thing. But so I'm curious what you found regarding that species, because it just kind of stands out now.
I hate to say it, it's a pretty unexciting species.
Yeah.
I mean, I followed them around on Barra Colorado Island, and I watched where they were eating little saplings, and basically like a lot of these forest tortoises, turtles, anything they can find on the forest floor. But it's just not very exciting and not very conspicuous. But it does seem to be very low density. And when we had our South American turtle workshop in Bolivia a few months ago, it got I think it got assessed. I don't remember now if it got assessed as vulnerable or least concern, but I was pushing for it to get a higher conservation status, because we do know so little about it. Does not seem to be heavily in the trade because it's not particularly attractive. It's a very drab turtle. But yeah, I mean, that was the first thing. That was the first study, and it wasn't much of a study that I did back in 1970. But not been a whole lot on it since then. So yeah, not much really to say about it.
Right. Talking about this with people while in Costa Rica and just hearing you say it is that there's a paucity of information about Central American turtles in general. I think a lot of opportunity for students in those countries now to do a lot of that work, and certainly international support and such. But yeah, it's an open area, it seems like.
Absolutely. Well, something we should talk about at some point is the importance of these small grant mechanisms. I mean, we have the Turtle Conservation Fund, and I've been managing a primate action fund for more than 40 years now. And these are small grants, usually $5,000 or less, that go to students and to particularly people from the habitat countries with very little bureaucracy. I mean, if you're coming out of college, or if you're still in college and you want to get a grant to do a study, if you have to go through an elaborate process and take 6 months or a year to get the funds, you're going to lose enthusiasm. So we, through these action fund grants, have a very quick turnaround time. And I've been able to support hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people through this since 1980, when I started it. And a number of those people who started out as students have now wound up in very influential positions in the international conservation community. So this is the sort of thing that we need to do more of for turtles. As I say, we have the Turtle Conservation Fund, but we need to have more funding mechanisms like that can get resources quickly into the hands of young people who are excited about doing turtle biology or any kind of biodiversity studies.
That's a really good thing. I think a lot of people that listen to this are younger and interested in research side of things at universities. Where can people access those resources? What's the way?
Well, you guys know about the Turtle Conservation
Yeah.
Fund, right?
Yeah.
Which, the funds are housed at Rewild, but we have a committee of something like 25 people who review these projects every few months. And we never have enough to do all of them, but we usually do 4, 5, 6 of the top projects. And we spent well over $1 million, probably closing in on $1.5 million since this fund was created. And they're all small grants, and they're turned around pretty quickly. I would like to create even more flexible mechanisms so that, as we do with the primates, that you can turn a proposal around within less than a month, right? And get it out the door.
Yeah.
So, we need to, one of the big things in this business, in the conservation business, is fundraising. Everybody involved in conservation needs to, at one level or another, become a fundraiser and find people out there who have the resources to help support conservation. And there are a lot of younger generation wealthy people out there. Every year we find new people who have very significant resources at their disposal, whether they earned them or whether they inherited them. And more, a lot of these people are interested in biodiversity. Some of them are specifically interested in species. So all of us should always be looking out for potential donors to help with the kind of projects, setting up the kind of funds that we have some of at Rewild, but we really need to have many more.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting take, especially from your position as a leader in that sort of capacity. It makes sense that you look for these large scale patterns, or look for how can you collaborate with people and make things happen for both parties. That's sort of what's your thought process in terms of when do you see something where you think this could be a good connection that could help both parties? What's the process for that?
Well, what I do, especially in this late stage of my career, and I've been in this business now for just about 55 years, I no longer try to go after government funding like USAID or the World Bank, Global Environment Facility, things like that. It's just too bureaucratic, too time-consuming. Managing it is very intensive, and you need all sorts of administrative mechanisms. So I go mostly after individual donors who are interested, who I know are interested, and then I take them on trips. I do a lot of trips to Madagascar. Last year, I did 4 of these donor trips to Madagascar, and I do them to Brazil, especially the Pantanal, Amazon, Atlantic Forest region of Brazil, occasionally to East Africa, occasionally to Suriname, and show people firsthand what we're doing. And you have them for 10 days, 2 weeks, and you really get to know them and interact with them. And very often, people will come through with funding support. Not always, but this is the way really of cultivating potential donors and imparting to them your knowledge and developing personal relationships with them, which, in many cases will pay off with long-term support for conservation. So a lot of the fundraising that I do these days is through mechanisms like that. Another way of doing it is by finding people of some means in your community who are interested in wildlife, and then ask them to hold dinners with some of their friends. Say, look, you're interested in this. Why don't you invite a dozen of your closest friends who might be interested in this, and then you guys go and give them a presentation, give them a PowerPoint on, the kind of work that you're doing with turtles. And sometimes you'd be surprised, people come out of the woodwork and show interest in work that you're doing, sometimes at a significant level. So, a lot of people say, I'm not a fundraiser. Everybody in this business has to be a fundraiser at one level or another. And if you're enthusiastic about your animals, and you can convey that enthusiasm, and you can take people out into the field and show them the stuff that you're doing, then you're a fundraiser, man. And you can't just depend on other people to do the fundraising. You got to be fundraisers yourselves.
So with that, you have to have a certain ability to communicate. I think a lot nowadays, a lot of science, there's sort of a lot of it's becoming so technically robust and complicated that it can be challenging sometimes to convey that. But what's your strategy? Because you've published, that the 800 publication list, going through it, it's a lot of scientific peer-reviewed articles, but there's also a lot of popular press sort of things. What is your strategy for effective communication?
Do all of it. Do the science so you have your scientific credibility, but write for popular magazines, write for whatever somebody's going to be interested in. But more and more these days, because people are reading less and less, you guys are already doing it, right? I mean, hell, you're way ahead of the game. You're already doing a huge outreach on turtles by having this Cheloniacast series. What do you guys? You guys are what, 21, 22?
20, 21. Yeah.
21. I mean, you're starting like way before most people get into it. You've already put something together that's huge. Now, how can you turn this into funding as well? I mean, you're connecting with a lot of people, and I would guess as this grows, you'll connect with some people who have fundraising funding potential, who could be donors. But you're already doing it. I mean, you're communicating a hell of a lot better than I was communicating at the same age. So, I mean, good for you guys, but you're already doing it. So you just need to figure out how you can make this somehow a mechanism, not just for communicating, but also for fundraising.
Social media has been a huge asset to us. I mean, that's how we all met each other too. Like, we wouldn't have met at such an early point in our lives, like when we were in our teenage years or whatever, without social media. And I mean, yeah, using the Cheloniacast for public outreach and using even just social media apps has just been an amazing way to like network with people. It's like I wouldn't have gotten anywhere near as far as I have without that, like at my young age. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, social media has just increased by multiple orders of magnitude what people are able to do these days. You know, stuff like crowdfunding. I mean, Mickey sometimes does crowdfunding for some of his plant expeditions. Those things didn't exist when I was growing up. I mean, you know, we're still writing letters. I mean, listen to this. And when I was in the field in the early 70s, right, it didn't do phone calls because it was too hard to find a phone and too expensive. So if I was traveling around, one of my big trips in 73, 74, when I would run out of money, I would send my mother a letter, and say, I'm going to this and this city. Please send me some traveler's checks to the nearest American Express office, okay, when I was running out of money. And that's how we did it. There was no fax, no email. Phone calls were generally not done. So everything was by letter. So it's so much easier nowadays. So you got all these advantages and through social media. And I think what you're doing is really something outstanding. And I think in some ways you could use it as a mechanism for finding people who could be potential donors. You don't want to turn it entirely into a fundraising mechanism. You want to maintain some purity, but this is how you find people who are interested in turtles who you might not otherwise find. How many listeners do you have now?
It's an interesting question. I mean, that's a really interesting perspective. I think we're all thinking about, you know, how can we continue to make it better? And to some extent, we had a fund that we're actually changing a bit now to put it back into the podcast itself, but it was to support student research. And there was some donation, but we didn't talk about it as much as we probably should have. And I think that there's a lot more capacity there to do good for research and to sustain this. You know, in-person interviews are optimal. And if we can go and actually visit, that would be huge. But regardless, the listenership is I've done some back of the envelope calculations for it. It's about 2,500 hours now of total time. And there's about 40 different countries in most US states. So a lot of people. Wow. Yeah. And it's for turtles, you know, it's really cool to see, you know, that we brought in through the social media. I think we get a better idea. Some of the statistics are kind of hard to measure online, but a lot of the social media accounts, you'll see the people that are actually involved and they get to interact, and it's a really cool thing. So
that's impressive. And I bet you've got some potential donors out there. I don't know, we should probably talk about, you know, on a separate call, how you could set up some sort of a small grant action fund that people who are listening to your podcast, if they're interested in actually supporting research, that they could contribute. If they're interested in going on a trip, I mean, hell, you guys are sitting in the middle of some of the highest turtle diversity in the world. Georgia, Florida. I mean, Alabama and Florida are number 1 and 2, and then comes Mississippi and Georgia and Louisiana, right? So you're sitting in turtle heaven, and you could do all sorts of cool trips. The other thing, I'll talk a little bit more about turtle watching and turtle ecotourism later as well. But probably the best place in the world for turtle watching is driving through those southeastern states, looking at the map turtles. You drive up to a bridge, and there you got 2 species of basking map turtles, and every river has a different set of species, right? Never mind all the other stuff. I mean, it's phenomenal. So you've got the potential there to do, turtle watching tours, get people excited about seeing these animals in the wild. And there is no place on the planet, and I look for turtles all over the place, there is no place that compares to the southeastern U.S., period.
Right. It is an incredible. It is. Yeah, we're really lucky to be located here for sure. It's I mean, we'll talk about that for sure. But in terms of, we can sort of shift back to just your early experience with turtles. I know that you had a trip in 1969 to Germany, and that sparked a lot of interest and such. Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah. Well, what happened was this: I went. I always wanted to go to Harvard because I was a big fan of John F. Kennedy, and I tried to get into Harvard as an undergraduate. When I first went to college, I didn't get accepted there, but I did get accepted in Dartmouth and Cornell. And I picked Dartmouth because they gave me a bigger scholarship. I'd never seen it. I got up to Dartmouth in 1967, and it was colder than hell. It's in New Hampshire. I hate the cold. I don't like snow. It was, for the first 2 years I was there, it was all men. And I thought, I got to figure out a way to get out of this place. Fortunately, they had excellent foreign study and foreign language programs. So I took advantage of those. I did a foreign study program in Germany. I did a foreign language program in France. I already spoke German, but I wanted to learn French and Spanish. And that's something else we should talk about, how important it is to learn languages if you're going to work in the tropics. And I first went to France, and then I went to Germany for 3 months, and I was based at the University of Mainz. And as it turned out, there was a herpetology course that was taught by a gentleman named Erhard Thomas, who was one of the early German herpetologists. So I got in touch with him, and he introduced me to Walter Sachse, who was an amazing character, extremely eccentric, really, really good guy. He had a relatively small apartment with his wife and 3 kids, and it was packed floor to ceiling, every room, with turtle tanks, mostly mud turtles, but everything under the sun, and species that I had never, ever seen before. And so I was super excited. And he kind of took me in and was really, really good. He took me to some of the meetings of the DGHT, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Herpetologie und Terrarienkunde, the German herpetological society then. And he introduced me to Robert Mertens. And Mertens was one of the great early herpetologists who wrote on all sorts of reptiles and amphibians. And I don't know if you've seen it, but he did the classic work in German, Vermuth and Mertens, which was the first really comprehensive checklist of turtles. And I think a lot of Peter Pritchard's book, The Living Turtles of the World, I think had its roots in that book. It was a very dry book, just no pictures, just a lot of text. But Mertens was the premier herpetologist at that time. And I met him, and I also met his protege, Konrad Klemmer, both at the Senckenberg Museum in Frankfurt. And I found out that Mertens had published 800 papers, okay? And that became kind of an objective for me. I thought, man, if this old German guy can publish 800 papers, I should be able to do the same thing. So that just kind of reinforced my desire to publish. But Sachse really cemented a lot of my interest in turtles, because I saw so many species that, even going to the Bronx Zoo and stuff like that, that I'd never seen before and didn't really know existed, other than as names in a dry old publication. And so after the French part of that trip, 3 months, and then the German part, 3 months, I got a Eurail pass, which cost almost nothing, and you could travel around Europe first class. I think it cost $25. And for the next 3 months, I traveled around Europe to 18 countries. And I decided I would do the whole cultural experience, go to art museums, to opera, all this stuff. But inevitably, whenever I went somewhere, I gravitated towards the zoos, right? I went to dozens of zoos. And in those zoos, I would gravitate to the reptile house and more also to the primate house. And that really kind of stimulated my interest in primates and reinforced the interest that I had in reptiles in particular. So, yeah, I mean, I can go on with that college experience too. And then I, although I wasn't there very much, I managed to get really good grades and graduated summa cum laude. And I got what was called the senior fellowship. And the senior fellowship basically meant that as a senior, you could do whatever you wanted for a whole year. And I decided by then my interest in primates had grown enough so that I said, okay, I'm going to go do some field work. And I first tried to work with Louis Leakey in Africa. I sent him like 3 letters, and you know who Louis Leakey is, right? Yeah, he rejected me 3 times. He's the one who supported Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, Baruthe Galdikas to study the great apes. And I said, I'd like to come and work in your primate center in Kenya. And I got rejected 3 times. So on my way to Costa Rica for the Spanish foreign language study, I visited Panama, people in the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And they told me that, look, if you can't get to Africa, why don't you just come and do some research here in Panama? And that's what I did. I went to Panama and studied at Barra Colorado Island, which is the first real tropical field station that ever existed. It is celebrating, last year it celebrated its 100th anniversary. This year we're going to have an event. It's the 101st year, but we're going to have a 100-year anniversary event. And I wound up doing a study of monkeys, howler monkeys, on Barra Colorado Island for 3 months. And that was the same time that I did the study of rhinoclemmies. I also published a list of the turtles that existed on that island. And then the remainder of that senior year, I put together a 300-page compendium on everything that was known of New World monkeys. And that's what really laid the groundwork for my career studying primates, which has always had in spite of all the time in Madagascar, it's always been strongly based in neotropical primates, the primates of South and Central America.
Right. And so your early time at Dartmouth, it's interesting. I've got some friends that went from the Costa Rica study abroad right to another one, and that seemed a little crazy to me, but would you suggest to travel as much as possible? Is that do you think that makes sense for a student?
Well, absolutely. I mean, no question, 100%. First of all, I don't like classes. I never liked going to classes, even though I did very well. I never liked classes. I hated laboratory work. I'm totally a field person. And so the 2 things I always say to young people like yourselves or even younger, take every opportunity you can get to travel. Don't listen to somebody. Don't see any obstacles. If somebody says, well, you can't do it, it's too expensive, just get out there and do it. Especially people from this country, you always have some resources available to get out there and travel around. And the other advice I give them is learn languages, okay? It's really important, especially if you're working in these tropical areas too. English more and more is becoming prevalent, but it's still usually appreciated if you can speak the language. So if you want to work in the Americas, learn Spanish. It's easy. From Spanish, you can learn Portuguese. It's also pretty easy. French gives you much of Africa. And with those 3 languages plus English, a lot of the world is available to you, and you can interact with people in ways that others who don't have those language skills are not able to do. So I speak 6 or 7 well, and bits and pieces of others, and it's been hugely beneficial to me. But travel is absolutely essential if you're going to, first of all, be a well-rounded individual. And secondly, if you're interested in conservation, if you're interested in biodiversity, most of it is in other countries, right? I mean, the United States is a pretty diverse place, especially areas like the Southeast, California, the Hawaiian Islands. But so much of the world's biodiversity is in these tropical regions. So yeah, get out there. I mean, my kids, I dragged them along from the time they were tiny. My oldest son, who's now 38, John, he's been to like 125 countries. Mickey, I think he's up around 80. His sister's probably up around 50 or 60. So get out there. You know, you can do it on the cheap, and don't miss the opportunities. I mean, you already started doing it, going to Costa Rica and things like that. But you know, there's so many cool places out there that you can get nowadays relatively easily.
Coming from you, we'll definitely take that to heart. I got to go to the Galapagos a few years ago with Russ Burke, and getting to go out of the country at such a young age was just amazing. And the Galapagos is one of my all-time favorite places, but I don't speak Spanish, so not having that was definitely a huge inconvenience. And I have firsthand experience of like why I want to have those other languages now. Like not having it was definitely.
And do it now when you're young, because when you get older, it gets harder, right?
Yeah.
From like 17 to 25, I was picking up almost a language a year. Now my brain is like non-functional, and your learning ability, your ability to learn languages really declines rapidly, right? Mm-hmm. Spanish is an easy language. And look, I have a theory that by 2050, we'll be speaking at least as much Spanish and probably more than English, because, you know, the population, Spanish-speaking people is growing. It's a language that persists. I mean, I spoke German. My kids don't speak German. German tends to disappear. Spanish doesn't, because it's got enough of a supporting environment so that it just continues to increase. So it's a good language to know. And if you know Spanish, you can fairly quickly learn Portuguese. That gives you Brazil and a bunch of the African countries. And then French is also not terribly difficult. So those Romance languages are, you know, compared to something like Chinese or Japanese, I mean, they're relatively easy languages to learn.
Right. I think, yeah, that's really good advice and different from what a lot of others have said. So and the way that you explain it in terms of you only need to know a few in order to access a large chunk of land, of area. But so you actually were roommates with Dr. Rodin, which was an interesting story. I'm curious how that happened and some of the trips that you guys went on. What was that like? And Peter Pritchard in Tales from the Thebaid talks about a study abroad in Iran and how after that everyone sort of don't travel with your friends, I think was his takeaway, is that everyone didn't like each other after that because you live with the same person. I'm curious if it was it tough to, at a certain point, you know, as things start to, you're around the same people, or what was it like to travel and how did that friendship start?
Well, it depends on the people you're traveling with, right?
Yeah.
Now, Anders and I weren't roommates. We were floor mates. We were on the same floor at Dartmouth. And I think I listened to his interview, and he explained it very well, how there were these three little red-eared sliders that were in our ecology course. And at the end of the course, the professor said, "Who wants these?" And he took them, and he didn't know what they were. But he said, "What are these?" And I told him it's Pseudomys scripta elegans. And he kind of fell in love with them. And then we decided, I think he explained this as well, we wanted to try to work in Africa with Dian Fossey on gorillas. And he sent Dian Fossey a letter, and that got rejected as well. And then later, it may be that she sent a letter while we were traveling in South America saying that we could come, but that letter never actually reached him. So that we will never know. That's shrouded in mystery. But we decided after graduating from Dartmouth in 71, we decided to do a trip through South America. So we started in Panama, flew down to Colombia, went down to Leticia, Colombia, where I had my first look at the Amazon. And that night I got as sick as I've ever been. I took some kind of medicine that I did not agree with me. I got sick as a dog. Then we flew from Leticia to Manaus in the central Brazilian Amazon. And that was the worst flight to this day that I've ever taken. I've probably flown 5,000 times now. That was absolutely the worst flight I've ever taken. brain came through the roof, the door flew open, everybody was thrown up. We thought we were dead. And so my introduction to the Amazon and to Brazil was not particularly pleasant, but I stuck with it, and still Brazil is my favorite country to this day. So from there, we did a little expedition, and he explained this as well, I think, up a nearby tributary river of the Rio Negro, the Rio Cuyeras. And there we found in a local dwelling, we found a little yellowfoot tortoise, baby yellowfoot tortoise, which locally is called jabuti. And Anders fell in love with it. He brought it back. And again, this was pre-CITES, pre-Endangered Species Act. He brought it back, and he just absolutely fell in love with that animal. And that kind of laid the foundation for his interest in turtles. So when I look back, and of course, I always provided them with a lot of information and positive feedback. And I look back, if Anders isn't the most influential person in turtle conservation and biology, I don't know who is. I mean, he started these journals. He started his own foundation. He's been chair of the specialist group. I mean, he's been involved. He's one of the founding members of the Turtle Conservation Fund. He's been absolutely fundamentally important to turtles. And my greatest contribution to turtle biology and conservation, without a doubt, is getting him interested in turtles. If I do nothing else in that regard, I can count that as a major feather in my cap. So we went down as far as southern Brazil. From Manaus, we went to Belém at the mouth of the Amazon. Then we took a bus ride of about 50 hours down to Brasilia. Back then, it was all dirt road. It was pretty miserable. And then from there to Rio, and from Rio to Sao Paulo. In Sao Paulo, he decided that he missed his girlfriend too much, so he bought her a wedding ring and then flew back. I continued on through Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador, and I basically made contacts on that trip that would serve me well in the years that followed. So that was like my 18-country trip to Europe in 1969. This 1971 trip was also very, very important in kind of forming my career before I went off to graduate school. But Anders is great to travel with. We still travel occasionally together. We did that expedition in '74 to look for Cainisterna and Angusta ponds. We've been in Madagascar together looking for the plowshares and the radiated tortoise and the pixies. We've traveled together a number of times.
That's awesome. And so then when you both ended up at the MCZ at Harvard, and you sort of fell into doing work with chelid, sort of osteology and sort of cladistics, I guess. Maybe you can talk a bit about that. What was that like? What were your initial thoughts about doing that work?
Well, I got into Harvard finally. I didn't get in the first time around. I got in for graduate school. And I got into the Department of Anthropology with a very charismatic professor named Erwin de Voer, who was one of these. He was one of the early primatologists. He studied baboons in particular and showed the linkages, how we could learn more about human evolution by studying primates and especially baboons. And he was one of those professors who was a facilitator. He brought in really, really good people, and you learn more from your fellow graduate students than you learn from your professors themselves. And I also, as soon as I got there, I went to the Museum of Comparative Zoology and visited Ernest Williams, who again was one of the early pioneers of research on turtles and then later on anolis lizards. He worked first with Arthur Loveridge, who was his predecessor at the Museum of Comparative Zoology, and then he did a bunch of turtle publications himself. And since I liked the MCZ better than I liked the Peabody Museum, I asked if he could give me office space. And he said, okay. So he stuck me in an office, and that wound up being the MCZ wound up being my base for the next, MCZ, of course, being the Museum of Comparative Zoology. And that wound up being my base for the next 6.5 years. And, I volunteered to do work on the collections there. And in particular, William said, look, I just got this big series of herps collected by an Australian guy working in New Guinea. New Guinea was then still part of Australia. I mean, it was basically a protectorate of Australia. It didn't go independent until 1975, and there were Australian police that were stationed all over the remote parts of New Guinea. And this guy, Fred Parker, he really liked herps, so he collected just bucket loads of herps and sent them back to the Museum of Comparative Zoology. And I was always interested I always thought side-neck turtles were fascinating because we don't have side necks in the US. So seeing these long neck turtles putting their heads in sideways instead of sticking them back straight in, I always thought they were super cool. So I went through the collection with Anders and we found some really interesting stuff, including, and I think he described this in his interview, this animal with a mottled head pattern that didn't look like anything that we knew about. We quickly decided that it was a new species, and William said, "You guys go ahead and describe it." So we did. It took us about 4 or 5 years to finally get it done, but we did publish it, and that was our first new species. So that was pretty exciting. And I kept the relationship with that department for a very long time. And in 1973, Williams and Paolo Vanzolini from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, in the 1950s, they had started a revision of the chelid turtles of South America, especially Brazil. But they're not easy to collect. And they accumulated a lot of information, but it was mostly from old specimens in different museums. They didn't do a whole lot of field collecting. And so they got a little frustrated. So in 73, Williams said to me, "Here, you take this." So he gave me a bunch of file cards and some other information, some early notes that they had taken, maps that they made. He said, "Here, you take this and you do the chelid revision," right? And to this day, we're still fiddling around with it. We did publish a new species or some information comes out from time to time. We describe Phrynops williamsi. We describe Acanthocheles macrocephala. We have 3 species right now that are in manuscript that we're resurrecting, old names that were sunk under Phrynops schifranus, and that we're resurrecting those names. And there are several new species that are going to come out of this as well. And so that, that again laid a foundation for what Anders and I would do in the future.
Yeah, it's just incredible work. I mean, it seems like, again, going through your sort of list of publications, there's a lot of things, and then there'll be a turtle-related paper that's something chelid-related, kind of scattered throughout. It was cool to see that, just how it's changed.
Chelid and Pelamedusa as well. Podocnemis.
Right. And that's honestly another interesting one. And you got to travel with Federico Menam a significant amount and work with the Podocnemis. I'm curious what those trips were like, and what did you learn about the river turtles that sort of stands out to you?
Well, Fred Menam was a great friend. The first time I ever went to South America, and this was with Anders, we stopped off at his place, the Instituto Roberto Franco in Villavicencio, Colombia, and he had an amazing collection of turtles and crocodilians. And he was a really interesting guy. He was basically Latvian aristocracy who got displaced by the Nazis and by the Russians, and so he wound up in Colombia and started a new life there. And he became, for a long time, the world's expert on the turtles and crocodilians of South America. So I visited him many times. I think I sent you a picture of Anders and myself with him in those one of those early visits. And the one field trip I did with him, I should at some point talk about my big 1973 expedition. But at one point during that 1973 Amazon expedition, I wound up in Manaus to get supplies. And I just happened to run across Fred Menam, who was doing a South America-wide survey of crocodilians for the Bronx Zoo. And we talked about turtles. And I said, look, this animal, Podocnemis erythrocephala, which then was still being called Podocnemis cayennensis. I later published the paper that showed that, in fact, erythrocephala was the correct name. I said to him, look, we're at the mouth of the Rio Negro. Why don't we go up and do an expedition to one of the small tributaries to see if we can find the nesting sites for Podocnemus erythrocephala, because they weren't really known back then. This was what I think September or October of 73. So we took the canoe that I had with the big expedition boat, and we went upriver to the Rio Cuyeras, which was actually the same river that Anders and I had been to a couple of years earlier. And we found nesting erythrocephala in what are called campinas. These are sandy areas in the middle of the rainforest with low scrubby vegetation, but the sand provides a good nesting site for the Podocnemus. And so we collected some eggs, we collected some adults, we went back into our canoe, we went back down towards Manaus, and it was a very windy day, and the Rio Negro at that area is about 10 kilometers. Yeah, so we were coming back with our turtles and our turtle eggs and all our equipment, and we turned a bend in the river. It was windy, and all of a sudden, the waves start hitting us. You don't think of waves in a river, but this is a big river, and the waves started hitting us. And when you get hit by, this has happened to me a number of times, when you get hit by waves, the first wave fills your boat, and you start bailing like crazy. The second wave fills your boat, and then you know you're screwed. And the third one kind of flips your boat over, and that's the end of the story. So our boat flipped over. My turtles and turtle eggs all disappeared. My camera and my binoculars went to the bottom of the river. I managed to save one lens, which floated because it was in a lens case, and my little green toothbrush cup, which I have to the present day. Those are the only things I could save, and I only had as clothing a ripped Speedo bathing suit. So we dove down and tried to get the equipment out of the river. We couldn't get anything, couldn't get the turtles. We did manage to save the boat and the motor. And we sat there on the riverbank until another boat came by and took us back to Manaus. And there I had to buy a new camera, new binoculars, the whole thing. But we did learn about the nesting behavior of Podocnemus erythrocephala, which in the 1974 paper that I did, I included all that information. I was I was in good shape then. I was a strong swimmer. I wasn't worried about dying. But poor old Fred, he must have weighed 300 pounds. And I was really glad we got him to the edge of the river and that he didn't wind up going to the bottom with everything else. So that was an exciting trip. But he was a real hero and a great friend, and really one of the people who put South American herpetology on the map.
Right, it definitely seems like it. I think. Well, I'm really excited to talk about your 1973 expedition, but before that, something that stands out to me with any river turtles, Podocnemus or Batagur, or really anything that lays a sort of intermediate number of eggs for a lot of turtles and has kind of a unique nesting habits. What do you think of how is it possible to sustainably harvest those turtles? Is that something that's possible?
Well, I wrote papers about this very early on in the 1970s. One paper, South American turtles, saving them through use. The problem with turtles is that they grow slowly. You can harvest the eggs to a limited extent, but raising the adult turtles to a size at which they're consumable, I think it's been tried a number of times. It's kind of hard. It requires a lot of space in terms of facilities for the animals, and you can potentially harvest them at low levels from the wild, which is easier. But frankly, I would rather not see turtles harvested for food at all. I'd rather see them become a tourist attraction. I'd rather see them recognized for the amazing ecosystem services that they provide. I mean, turtles in pristine densities of the kind that you had with the river turtles in Amazonia when the first explorers started going there, they produce enormous ecosystem services. Same with tortoises. I mean, that's something that I think we need to highlight more in terms of their value. So, they're going to continue to be harvested, and we've got to try to control that and manage that as much as possible, because in many places it's just a downward trend and not at all sustainable. But some of the good experiments have been done in Brazil, but I don't necessarily see that as a long-term solution anymore.
Interesting. So your view on it has sort of changed as the situation has become a bit more sort of immense.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at trying anything back in the 70s and 80s, anything that might work, and if you raise them in captivity, you take the eggs and you save all the hatchlings. But it takes a long time for them to reach an eatable size. Let's put it that way. Take the Podocnemus expansor. It takes years for them to reach a size at which you can actually use them as a source of food. Maybe you could do a very small offtake from the wild, which in fact in places like Amazonia is happening anyway. But it's tricky. It's really tricky with those animals.
Right. Yeah, it's something that, it seems like in a lot of cases, it's just you take out adult turtles and you're just causing this pretty immense impact. But
yeah, especially with turtles, because the older they get, they're not like humans. The older they get, the more they reproduce, right? The more eggs they produce. So you don't want to be taking out the big animals because they're your best reproducers. So it's tricky. It's tricky.
Right. And so, I mean, the eggs too is something, okay, there's a bit more, potentially one egg matters a bit less, but then you look at some of the figures in the past and it's, if you've got 40 million plus eggs destroyed, then that's
a lot.
Yeah. Right. So you had this large expedition that you were essentially retracing the steps of some famous naturalists in the past. Maybe you could talk a bit more about this. This sounds like really fascinating.
Yeah, well, there are deep origins again, going back to the Bronx Zoo for this. When I was a kid, it wasn't actually in the primate house. There was I forget what building it was, but there was one of the buildings there had some monkeys, and one of the monkeys was the white wakari. You familiar with that? The wakari monkeys? They're the only short-tailed Amazonian monkey, and there are three different kinds, basically. There's a black one with a black face. There's a red one with a bright red face and red fur. And there's a white one with long, shaggy white fur and a bright red face. And I saw this animal in the 60s in the Bronx Zoo. And it was the only one in captivity in the world at that time. And they've hardly ever been in captivity since then. And this was about the time that they were starting to talk about the Yeti, the abominable snowman, based on Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay's climbing of Mount Everest. And so there was a lot of fluff about the abominable snowman. And I looked at the white wakari and I thought, God, this looks like a mini abominable snowman. And I thought, this is a really cool monkey. I got to see this. This is on my bucket list. We didn't call it a bucket list back then, but I thought, I got to see this animal in the wild. So when I got to graduate school, I decided to try to study wakaris in the wild. No non-local person had ever seen wakaris in the wild. The early naturalists like Bates and Wallace had seen them, but they were pets in villages. They did not see them in the wild because they were pretty remote. So I joined forces with with Harvard and with the Museum of Zoology in Sao Paulo, which had a couple of expedition boats. And I rented those boats for 4 months and traveled all around the Amazon, basically retracing the steps of Alfred Russel Wallace, the great explorer naturalist who spent 4 years in the Rio Negro and then went 11 years to Indonesia, Malay Archipelago, and I think is one of the great explorers of all time, in addition to coming up with the theory of evolution at the same time as Darwin and stimulating Darwin to finally publish. And the other one was Henry Walter Bates, who was basically a butterfly collector, but also a great general naturalist. And they did these incredible expeditions. Bates's book, The Naturalist on the River Amazons, is really something to read. And I decided to retrace their steps and look for all of the different kinds of wakaris, which then were There were then 3. They've been split a lot since then, but there was the red, the black, and the white. And no one knew much of anything about them. They thought they were really, really endangered and almost extinct and all of that. And at the same time, because I was using the boats of the Museum of Zoology in Sao Paulo, herpetology department, I collected herps for them as well and learned a lot about the turtles of Amazonia. So I wound up first going up the Rio Tapajós, then the Rio Negro. And in the Rio Negro, I found that rather than being rare, the black wakari was one of the most common monkeys in the tributary rivers there. I went further up the mainstream of the Amazon and some of the other tributaries, found the white wakari, found the red wakari, and also learned a lot about the Podocnemus turtles. I saw nesting beaches of Podocnemus sextuberculata, which, by the way, I'm worried about now. It's not getting much attention, but it's a species that is a beach nester like Podocnemus expansa, and it's not getting the same level of protection as the big one. Podocnemus unifilis, which actually is much more adaptable because it's not an obligate beach nester. It nests just about anywhere that it can find a place to nest. And I visited in the Rio Trombetas in November at the end of that expedition, one of the big tabuleros, the big nesting areas for Podocnemus expansa, which is just phenomenal. So I learned a lot about turtles and other herps on that trip. And to this day, I think it's my greatest expedition. I mean, I found so many new things. I collected a lot of species for the Harvard and the Sao Paulo museums. And basically, I also decided on that trip that as much as I love the wakaris, the conditions for studying were so difficult because they basically existed in the flooded forests of places like the Rio Negro and the Rio Solomon, the upper Amazon. I said, I don't think I can do my thesis on these animals because it would take me about 5 years. So I went back. There were other things I did on that South America trip for 1.5 years. But when I went back to see my advisor, Irvin DeVore, I went in and he said, oh, you ready to write your thesis? And I said, not quite. I think I'm going to have to start all over again. So fortunately, in the interim, I found that in the country of Suriname, there were no wakaris, but there were bearded sakis, which are similar in ecology, although they look very different, similar in ecology to the wakari. So I wound up doing my thesis in Suriname instead of doing it in the Brazilian Amazon. As far as the turtles are concerned, I learned a lot about the Podocnemus turtles on that trip and got really excited about trying to do more for their conservation.
It's really interesting how, you came in with a focus on one group of organisms, on primates, and then I have all these other observations. It's sort of a given in those situations, but that you're attuned to all of these different things going on and interested in everything. I think you get a lot more out of it than just focusing on one thing. It's really interesting.
Yeah, well, I have a strong species focus. I really like turtles and primates. And I know a fair amount about other species, but those have really been my focal areas. And through the primates, because look, 90% of primates are tropical forest animals, and tropical forest conservation is necessary if you want to make sure that the primates don't disappear. So through my interest in primates, I got very interested in tropical forest conservation overall. And so I've been working for a good part of my career on tropical forest issues.
Right. Yeah, we will get into that shortly because that's sort of the next level of things. But just sort of as a journey into a slightly different area, you've done some work in Asia and trips in Asia, and this is a turtle hotspot in sort of a broad sense. But I'm curious what your most notable turtle encounters in Asian countries has been.
Boy, finding turtles in Asia is very different from finding turtles in the U.S. or in South America. It's really hard. I mean, India, you can see turtles fairly easily, at least some of the species, like some of the big soft shells and things like that. When you get to China, when you get to Southeast Asia, it's really hard. I mean, one of my favorite short wasn't an expedition, just a very short visit, was finally seeing the big-headed turtle, Platysternum megacephalum, in the wild. And that was on a property owned by Kadoorie Farms in Hong Kong. And, it's basically nocturnal animal living in these little tiny cold mountain streams. So we managed to see that one in the wild, which was very cool. And then I've seen a fair number in India. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, it's really, really tough. Now, if you want to count Australia as part of Asia, which it's not, but Australia is a different story. Australia is also a wonderful place for seeing turtles. It's one of my favorite places for wildlife in general. Even though there are no primates, there's sure a lot of other stuff that's interesting, and it's really, really quite nice to see turtles.
Right. Yeah. We've had the fortune of talking with John Cann and some others from Australia on the podcast, and just, there's a lot of diversity there in terms of species diversity in the chelids. So one area
you can actually see them.
What was that?
I said, you can actually see them when you go and look. I mean, for my 70th birthday, I made a special trip with my girlfriend and my son and some of the key guys from Rewild. We went looking for Pseudomedura with Gerald Kushling. And on my 70th birthday, I found them in the wild, which was absolutely wonderful. And then we went up north to the Darwin area to look for the pig-nosed turtle, Greticheles. So by seeing those two, and then later we can get into turtle watching and turtle life listing, with those two turtles, which represent separate families, I managed for my turtle life list to see all turtle families in the wild.
Wow.
That's amazing.
That's an amazing accomplishment. Hopefully all of us at some point, but that's going to take some time if we can. But so a country that you spent a lot of your work is Madagascar, and it's come up a few times. And I had the fortune of going in 2018 as a 8th grader, which was it was a really wild scenario for the confiscation of tortoises. And I had contacted Jordan Gray, and we talked a little bit, and I said, I could probably get there. I'm effectively done with middle school, and we figured it out, and I got, they supported me to go, which was awesome. But so that, I mean, it holds a special place for me as well. The first big trip I've taken. But I'm curious sort of with your work with turtles there and how you think turtles are faring in Madagascar, and why is Madagascar such a special place?
First of all, it's really incredible that you got to go to Madagascar so early in your life. I didn't get there until I was 34, so good for you. And
it was
that confiscation.
But yeah.
That's terrific. You guys are very motivated, which is really, really terrific. So Madagascar, okay, why Madagascar? First of all, Madagascar is probably the #1 biodiversity hotspot in the world. If you study primates, Brazil is the most diverse country on earth for primates. It's got like 155 different kinds. Madagascar, which is only about 1/7 the size of Brazil, is #2. And in Madagascar, we're at 112 different species and subspecies, all of them endemic. Okay, not found like everything else in Madagascar. Most of it's endemic. The reptiles are about 99% endemic. The primates are 100% endemic. The frogs are 99% endemic, and so on and so forth. So it's really, in many ways, a mini continent. And when we look at primates, we recognize 4 major regions for primates. Okay, we recognize the neotropics, South America, Central America, Mexico. And then mainland Africa, continental Africa, is another major region for primates. And then Asia is the 3rd major region for primates. The 4th is Madagascar, even though it's only about 1 to 2% the size of these other continental regions. Because of its enormous primate diversity and endemism, we recognize it as a major region. So, it's been called the 8th continent, and for certain groups of organisms, it really is the 8th continent. So if you study primates and you're concerned about primate conservation, you can't avoid Madagascar because it's by far and away the highest primate conservation priority in the world. About 95% of those 112 different kinds of lemurs are endangered, either critically endangered, or vulnerable. So it's a major challenge trying to conserve them. And that's what got me to Madagascar in the first place, the first visit being in 1984, 40 years ago. For reptiles, it's also spectacular. Highest chameleon diversity in the world. And the turtles and tortoises that occur there, again, endemic. And all of the endemic species are critically endangered. You got the Erimnacheles, the Madagascar big-headed sideneck. You've got the 3 different kinds of Pixis arachnoides, which I think should be elevated to full species. You got Pixis planicauda in a very limited area. You know the radiateds very well because you worked on them. And then you got the plowshares, which are close to unifera. They're close to extinction in the wild. And really, a lot of people, not a lot, but a number of people are really working hard now to try to conserve them. So from a turtle tortoise conservation perspective, it's one of the highest priority areas in the world.
What do you think, just going there and seeing it and sort of seeing the situation a lot of people are in, it puts it into perspective. And in terms of conservation, it seems like it could be challenging to get things done. But what do you think is the most effective way to make strides in the areas where radiated tortoises, sort of poaching, plowshares, that the areas where it seems like things are not looking great conservation wise? How do you think what's the best way to conserve the turtles and tortoises in Madagascar?
Well, it's a very frustrating frustrating country in which to work because 90% of the natural habitats are already gone. The human population is still going up like crazy. When I first went there, I think there were about 7 or 8 million people. Now the estimates run around 28 million, and that's going to continue to grow. The country is one of the, depending on what analysis you look at, it's one of the 5 to 10 poorest countries in the world. The government generally hasn't shown a lot of interest in conservation. The rest of the world loves Madagascar. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of publications, and people are going there all the time to see these animals in the wild. I mean, it's frustrating. You beat your head against the wall a lot, but it's so important. You can't give up on it, right? You can't say, "Oh, I'm giving up," because it's just too much of a pain. There's too much at stake there, so you have to continue to try to do what you can. I really believe that Madagascar could become a major focal area globally for ecotourism, right? The animals are easy to see there. The plants are also very exciting. Once you're there, it's relatively easy to go out and see things in the wild. It's not like trying to find primates in the Amazon, for example, which can be quite challenging. You go to the right places in Madagascar. I usually take groups there, and in 10 to 12 days, we usually see 20 species of lemurs in the wild, not to mention all the other stuff that you can see. So I am also very impressed with the development of local guide associations, local people from the villages who've become very capable tour guides. This is something that we've supported over the past 30 years. And those communities that have tourism benefit greatly. They earn much more than other rural people. And it's growing every year. We got a little bit of a setback with COVID because everything shut down, but it's coming back quickly. And I think that, as Costa Rica has done with ecotourism, I think that Madagascar could become one of the premier ecotourism destinations in the world. And one of the things that I've been doing, we can talk about this later, is stimulating this idea of primate watching based on a bird watching model. And then also, as an outgrowth of that, turtle watching and turtle life listing. And Madagascar is a great place for primate watching, obviously. It's a great place for turtle and tortoise watching. And if you're interested in other reptiles, you can see a whole bunch of chameleon species and other reptiles and amphibians relatively easily. So, and then, as I said, the plant diversity is also fascinating. And sometimes when I take people, especially to the southern spiny desert area, which you've been in it, it's a fantastic ecosystem for these plants that don't occur anywhere else in the world. So that's my hope. That's my hope for Madagascar, and it's what I'm focusing on heavily now is trying to develop, first of all, protecting as many of the remaining forests as we can, and working with local communities so that they're benefiting economically from the presence of these forests and the animals that occur in them.
So you've worked with something that's related to Madagascar, but perhaps just applicable at a global scale. Is you've worked with past presidents and political leaders, and that's closely tied with conservation. I'm curious, what can you say about what that process is like, and how important is it to network with people at all levels?
Well, if you're going to be a successful conservationist, you got to work from all levels, from indigenous people, local communities, which I'm very interested in and have been for a long time, to local and national NGOs, businesses sometimes if possible, government agencies at all sorts of different levels, and up to the level of head of state. I think I did a count a while back. I think I've met with about 50 heads of state over the course of my career. It isn't always very productive. Sometimes it is. Sometimes you can make some progress. But I've met now 4 presidents of Madagascar, and we talk about a lot of things, and sometimes there's some results, but it never is the level of follow-up and commitment that I would like to see. I certainly would like to see the government in a place like Madagascar and in other parts of the world become more engaged, but it's hard. It's hard, which is why, in this latter stage of my career, I focused a lot of attention on working with local communities, because the local communities aren't going away. They're always there. Governments come and go. Governments change. We made great progress with one of the presidents of Madagascar in the first decade of the millennium, and then he got kicked out in a coup, and it started all over again. So, it's not easy.
I wanted to ask about the Rimnikellies. Like, how difficult is it to see them in the wild at this point? Like,
there are a few places where you can see them. If you go to a national park in the northwest called Ankara Fansika, there is a lake. It's right. The main station of Ampitsuru is right on a lake. They're difficult to see in that lake because there's a lot of big crocodiles, including man-eating crocodiles. No joke. But you can walk to another lake, which is probably about, 2 or 3 kilometers away, where it's a small lake. It's relatively easy to see them. And there are a few other places where you can see them. They're not big baskers, but you can see them. Maybe they'll come out on a log sometimes, but you can see their little heads sticking out.
Yeah. Did you ever notice any difference between like habitats with them? Like any difference in morphology, like head size or anything like that? Like one's coming out of rivers versus lakes, or is it all just kind of the same?
Not really. I mean, I don't think there's enough of a sample size to be able to tell, but there's some talk that the northern and the southern populations might be different species, but I haven't seen anything convincing yet. And I would be surprised if that's the case, but could be. You never know. I mean, there's a lot that we don't know about these animals, but at this point, I would say probably not.
Yeah.
They're cool animals, though. They're very much like the peltocephalus in Amazonia. I mean, the big heads, and they're very cool.
So I'm curious. I think this is a good segue into sort of the global biodiversity conservation focus that you've had. That's unique. I think a lot of people focus on different taxonomic groups, but don't necessarily jump to the global sort of perspective. And I'm curious what led to that throughout your career, starting with focusing on primates, turtles, but then getting to the point where you're on this sort of large paper, the biodiversity hotspots concept. And so how did you sort of get to that global scale? What was the process leading up to that?
Well, I've been interested in the behavior and ecology of individual animals, but I've been more interested in global patterns of diversity, how the fauna and floras of different parts of the world relate to one another. And then from a conservation perspective, what are the highest priority areas? We have limited resources, although not as limited as some people sometimes think. I think the potential for much more fundraising is there, but the resources that we have, I think, need to be deployed to the places that are the highest priorities, which is why I've espoused for a long time concepts like biodiversity hotspots, megadiversity countries, and things like that. Now, the megadiversity country concept is something that I came up with in 1986. I first gave a talk about it at the big biodiversity conference in Washington, D.C. that was organized by Ed Wilson. After that, I published a book on it in, I think, 1996. And we've now gotten it up to 18 different countries that are, out of the 200 or so countries in the world, are responsible for about 2/3 of all biodiversity, both terrestrial, freshwater, also marine. And so if you're concerned about biodiversity at one level, you really got to pay a lot of attention to these countries. Number one and number two, vying for the position of the most diverse countries on earth, Brazil and Indonesia. Colombia is a very clear third. And then you have places like Peru, Ecuador, Madagascar, the Philippines, Congo, DRC, South Africa, a number of other countries that also fall into that megadiversity country concept. So you don't want to forget about those countries if you're looking at saving biodiversity globally, because if there's 2/3 of global biodiversity in those countries and you lose what's there, then you lose a big piece. That leads to the concept of biodiversity hotspots, which is a concept that was first developed by Norman Myers, the British ecologist. In 1988, he published a paper in which he recognized 10 biodiversity hotspots. And I saw that and I said, wow, this is brilliant. This really kind of encapsulates some of my own thinking about where the priority areas are. But I noticed that he was missing a lot of them. So I sent him a message. I knew him reasonably well. And I said, Norman, this is great, but you're missing some. So he published another paper in 1990 that recognized 18 biodiversity hotspots. And then I tried to convince World Wildlife Fund, where I'd been working for almost 11 years, to take on the biodiversity hotspots concept. And they didn't do it. And so I got frustrated, and I had an opportunity to move to Conservation International in the middle of 1989. And I moved and I took that biodiversity hotspots concept with me. And for the better part of the next 20 years, that was the driving strategy for the efforts of Conservation International, with great effect. And we raised a hell of a lot of money for conservation in the hotspots. Now, the essence of the hotspots concept is based on both high levels of endemism and high degree of threat. If you look at we've revised the hotspots a number of times. We did 2 books on them. We did many papers, and we're now up to 36 biodiversity hotspots. The most recent being the southeastern coastal plain of the U.S., which we talked about in terms of turtle diversity. It's also a very high area for plant endemism, crayfish, fish, et cetera, et cetera. But these 36 hotspots once occupied about 16% of the land surface of the planet, which is an area roughly equivalent to Russia and Australia combined. Now they've lost about 90% of their original natural vegetation cumulatively. So what remains is a little bit more than 2% of the land surface of the planet, which is an area that's roughly equivalent to the country of India or the 5 largest American states put together. Not a very big area, right, in global terms. And yet in these hotspots, in what remains of these hotspots, you've got something like minimum of 50% of all vertebrates and plants as endemics, non-fish vertebrates mostly, although you do have a lot of fish diversity in them as well. So if you lose that 2+% of what remains of the hotspots, you're at risk of losing more than 50% of global biodiversity. And as we know, places like Madagascar over the next 20, 30 years in your lifetimes could very well lose the vast majority of their biodiversity. So in terms of a strategy, I've pushed very hard to focus on these hotspots as priority areas, and we've been pretty successful in doing that. as a complement to the hotspots, you've got what I first called major tropical wilderness areas and now changed to high biodiversity wilderness areas, which are basically the big rainforest blocks, Amazonia, which is the biggest rainforest area, the Congo forests of Central Africa, and the island of New Guinea, which are still 70, 80%, in some cases 90% intact. And there's one desert area that's included there, and there's one woodland savanna area from Southern Africa that's in there. North American deserts, which are very important for tortoises, the Mojave, the Chihuahua, the Sonoran Desert. That area is by far the richest desert region on Earth, really by far the highest diversity of desert ecosystems. So those are the high biodiversity wilderness areas. So between the high biodiversity area, wilderness areas, and the hotspots, you're accounting for a very large portion of the world's biodiversity in maybe 8% of the surface, the land surface of the planet. So it makes sense that if we want to really conserve biodiversity, we need to focus a lot of attention on these areas. Now, we also have a process called the key biodiversity areas, which are looking at a finer scale. What are the areas that are also critical for biodiversity, but down the next level down? And that process is also very well developed. So we have all these priority setting mechanisms identifying areas where we need to work available to us. We just need to get on with the business of doing everything that we possibly can to get the job done. And if you look at areas like Amazonia, and right now in Brazil, for example, which is 60% of the Amazon region, we have a good government in place, and we're working very closely with this new government. The previous government, the Bolsonaro government, was awful, but now the Lula government has been very effective. And when you look at a place like Brazil, and in the Amazon in general, a lot of the action in terms of biodiversity protection for the future is going to be not just in traditional parks and reserves, but also in indigenous areas. In fact, some of the largest areas under protection in Amazonia are in these indigenous lands. And I've spent a lot of time working with indigenous people as well.
Right. Yeah. I think it's an interesting concept. It's kind of this optimization function between the amount of land and biodiversity. And it makes it kind of an easy thing for people to say, okay, you're going to get your most bang for your buck by doing this kind of at this scale. Right. And it's figuring out the scale. What's the percentage that is necessary to protect? So we've talked a bit about sort of how do you kind of quantify biodiversity and make it in packages where people can sort of look at it and say if they want to conserve it, methods for how to get people interested in it. But why should people care about biodiversity at a large scale? And I think that scales down to different taxonomic groups. But what is the purpose for doing all of this protection?
Look, this is the only living planet that we know of. And, in spite of all the talk about life on other planets, I don't think we're going to find significant life anywhere else in this solar system. And if there is life elsewhere in other systems, it's going to be so far away that it's going to be almost meaningless to us. So we have this one amazingly unique planet that we live on that I believe is unique in the universe. And we are living species ourselves. So if we let it go to hell, if we lose all those other species out there, a major portion of the other life forms that we depend on for our own survival, ultimately, in one way or another, it's going to impact us. We've become a very abundant species. And if we lose the buffering that all these other life forms, all these other ecosystems provide for us, we ultimately are going to become more of a target for emerging diseases, parasites, so on and so forth. Those aren't going away. They're going to survive longer than most of the other species out there. And we're going to become more and more vulnerable to the impacts of these different kinds of diseases. We saw it with COVID. We've seen it with many, many other emerging diseases. If you're interested in this topic, you should read the books by David Quammen, because he does the best job of anyone really highlighting what these different outbreaks, these different emerging diseases can do can do to our own species. But, for me, more than anything else, it's an aesthetic, it's a spiritual reason for protecting other life forms. But in many countries that are developing and poverty level, we've got to also put conservation in economic terms, showing that the maintenance of biodiversity, the maintenance of healthy ecosystems is in the best interests of everyone, and also a source of revenue for people who are living in poverty or at the edge of poverty. So that's why I'm excited about things like ecotourism. It can't solve everything, but certainly in close proximity to those areas that we are most concerned about, I think it can have a very significant impact. We've seen that in Madagascar. We're seeing it in many, many other parts of the world, with places like Costa Rica being ideal models. But there are other models emerging as well, like the country of Rwanda. Rwanda went through hell in 1994 with the genocide, and yet they've come out really well because of good leadership. And I would say in large part because of the importance of mountain gorilla tourism, which has now been expanded to include wildlife tourism and other ecosystems as well.
Right. There's a lot it's kind of, Dr. Rodin put it in an interesting way too, saying it's sort of this moral imperative just for turtles, but it's kind of, like you said, an aesthetic. It's this, it's unique. We have this here and we should work to protect it. So, and
yeah, it's easy for us in the developed world to talk about the moral imperative because, we're not worrying about where the next meal is going to come from. But even in poorer societies that are living on the edge, you do see that there is an understanding of biodiversity. There's a deep cultural significance in many different cultures that around the world. So we should not underestimate the cultural value of biodiversity to many different societies. But at the same time, we got to recognize the economic imperative that in a lot of the short term, we need to demonstrate to local communities in particular, regional, national governments, that conservation of biodiversity is also in many ways the best economic alternative. And short-term destruction for timber production or wildlife trade or whatever is just not sustainable and not good ultimately for people overall.
Right. And so you've taken this concept of high biodiversity wilderness areas, hotspots, and applied that to turtles specifically. And so how did what was the process for acquiring the data for that like? I mean, that must be quite the undertaking.
Well, it is. Yeah. Always getting data for these sorts of things is difficult. I mean, Kurt Buhlman led the first paper that we did that was published in Chelonian Conservation and Biology, looking at river basins. And that came up with some very good results. And then we adopted a more traditional hotspots approach, which again came up with a lot of the same areas being priorities for turtle conservation, but we added a few that were not on the list. Actually, the southeastern U.S., before it became a global biodiversity hotspot, very clearly came out as a hotspot for turtles. Now it's a hotspot for everything. Ganges, Brahmaputra. There are a few others. I haven't looked at that paper in a while, but there were a few others that came out as turtle hotspots that were not at that point recognized as global biodiversity hotspots. But in general, there's a very good overlap between turtle priorities and global biodiversity priorities overall. The megadiversity country concept lends itself very nicely to turtles, with U.S., Mexico, India, Indonesia, Brazil, China, Colombia, Australia, all coming out as top countries. The only one that is on that top 10 list for turtles that's not on the megadiversity country list at this point in time, and we probably need to revise megadiversity concept as well, is Vietnam, because Vietnam has very high turtle diversity as well. But there's a very strong overlap between the highest priority countries for biodiversity in general and for turtles.
Right. And that's a positive thing, right? It's the concept optimized.
Absolutely.
Right. And so on the more sort of the stuff that doesn't make it into the papers necessarily, the academic papers, is just the personal experience. And you've had experiences in all of these places. I'm curious, what are the moments that stand out the most related to the to turtles in the turtle priority and biodiversity hotspot areas, or what are the areas that stand out the most to you?
Well, Amazonia, because I've spent a lot of time in Amazonia, seeing a lot of these turtle species in the wild has always been a priority for me. I knocked off almost all of the Podicnemis. I still haven't seen Peltocephalus in the wild, and that's definitely on my bucket list. I finally did see Podicnemis leviana about 7 or 8 years ago in Colombia, and I just last year got to see Phrynops rufipace in the wild. Some of my colleagues, it's a beautiful little turtle. I sent you some pictures of that, and that's a really beautiful little turtle. And some of my Brazilian colleagues helped me out with that. They set net hoop traps, right? Each of them about 15 meters long. 5 of those, and we caught one Phrynops rufipace. One. So it's not a very abundant turtle, but I sent you the pictures of it, and I was really happy about that. And then seeing, species that you described, like Acanthocheles macrocephala. I've been to the Pantanal region of Brazil quite a few times. I think probably at least a dozen times now. And not until my last trip did I finally see an Acanthocheles macrocephala. And I sent you pictures of that as well. I'm actually in that picture. I'm actually holding the description in one hand and holding the turtle in the other hand. We described that animal. I think it was in 1984, and I didn't get to see it until. Yeah, there we go. I didn't get to see it until last year. And then Australia. Every time I go to Australia, I try to see some turtles in the wild there. I really want to try to see all of the Australian genera. But getting to see Pseudomedura with Gerald Kuchling, who's basically the guy who saved it, was really exciting. And then getting to see the pig-nosed turtle up in the Daly River in the Northern Territory near Darwin. That's a crazy habitat because you've got several other turtle species there, and in that river you've got both freshwater crocodiles and saltwater crocodiles. And we saw some of the Cheloniacast, and we were about to jump. My son Mickey was with me, and we were about to jump out of the boat to try to catch one. And then about a minute later, we saw about a 3-meter saltwater crocodile right next to us. So it's a good thing we didn't jump in.
Yeah.
But
that region is. Yeah,
Scott Thompson told us some crazy stories about that same river with all the crocodiles.
Yeah, you don't want to swim there. The freshies are okay, but saltwater crocodiles are really scary animals. And let's see. Oh yeah, in Madagascar, when we did that trip, I think it was in 2008 or 2009. Anders, myself, Eric Good, a number of others. We went looking for the plowshares up in the one place where they occur in the Bay of Bali, and we were super lucky because we got not only a big male, a big female, and a hatchling on that trip. Now, if they even occur in the wild anymore, we're not sure. I think there's probably some hanging on because the habitat is very dense vegetation, but they're basically heading rapidly towards being extinct in the wild. So getting to see them in the wild was really cool. And the other one is Pixis planicauda. I've been in that habitat multiple times over the past 40 years, but there's only one way to see Pixis planicauda, and that is in January, late December or January after a heavy rain. And that's it. If you look for them otherwise, forget it. If you go right after a heavy rain, and I've done it twice in January, you find them. I just saw one a few weeks ago after a heavy rain. But that's the only way you can see those little buggers. So it's really hard. And of course, then, sea turtles. I'm not a sea turtle specialist, but I love sea turtles, especially leatherbacks. And I was really lucky the first time I saw a leatherback in the wild was in 1975, my first trip to Suriname. I went to one of the coastal beaches at Galibi in Suriname. And I think it was actually the first nesting sea turtle I ever saw. It was a leatherback out in bright sunlight early in the morning. And it was just an amazing experience. To this day, I think it's my best sea turtle experience.
That's incredible. So you mentioned Peltocephalus is one that you haven't seen yet. Are there any other turtles that are just animals in general that that's your focus now, or anything you really want to see?
Bucket list species. Well, certainly Peltocephalus is up there because of my strong interest in the, that group of turtles, the podocnemine turtles. Peltocephalus is the last one that I haven't seen in the wild of that group, because I've seen all the Madagascar one and all the other South American ones. In terms of other animals, king cobra is one I have not yet seen in the wild. That was one that, going back to the days of the Bronx Zoo, that was a snake that I saw in the reptile house there, and I thought, God, I got to see that in the wild. So that one's on the list. And then the red panda in China and neighboring countries. That one, you can apparently see them now in the wild. I did finally get the giant panda in the wild after 7 trips over 27 years. I finally did get to see a wild giant panda. Komodo dragons I've seen. Very cool. What others are on my list? Well, there's some that I'll probably never see, like the okapi in the Eastern Congo. That's really hard, really dangerous. Mountain tapir, Malayan tapir. I had tried seeing the Malayan tapir last year. I didn't get it. I've got the other 2 species, but the mountain tapir, now apparently there are some places in Ecuador where you can see it. Let's see, other turtles that are reasonably. Well, I'm in terms of, I didn't talk about life listing yet, but you want me to give you a little background on the whole life listing business and watching business, and then we can get into the relevance for turtles?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I've always been a lister. I'm a collector. I collect all sorts of stuff, and collecting species sightings is just another form of collecting. So I've been a life lister forever. And I've been primate life listing for a very long time. And about 25 years ago, I started this idea of primate watching and primate life listing. And since then, I've been promoting it. We published a lot of field guides and pocket guides. I think I sent you guys some of them. I'll send some more. You should give me all of your addresses so I can send each of you this stuff. And so little by little, starting back in 1970, when I saw my first wild primate in Tikal in Guatemala, it was a spider monkey. I've been racking up the primate numbers. And a while back, I realized that I'm never going to see all primates. We're up to about 720 different kinds of primates. I've got the biggest life list of primates, well over 400, but I'm never going to see all of them. I'm never even going to come close. So I thought, what is a manageable thing to try to see? And I decided, okay, let me try to see all primate genera, right? Yeah. So there are now 83 primate genera, and I've been trying to get all of them for a long time. And in 2018, BBC contacted me about they were doing a very nice series on primates, and they asked if there was something that I'd like to focus on. And I said, yeah, focus on primate watching and primate life listing. And why don't you come with me when I see the last of the primate genera in the world that I was still missing? And that one that I was focusing on was the kipunji, which is a strange kind of half baboon, half mangabe type animal found only in a small area in southern Tanzania. And they said, great, yeah, let's do that. But then I realized that there were 2 other genera that I hadn't seen yet. One was a East African galago, and the other one was Myopithecus, the talapoin monkey from West Africa. So I had to scramble to get out to those places and see those other 2 genera, so that the sighting of the kipunji actually worked. But it worked out well, thanks to Tim Davenport, who's worked a lot in East Africa and works for us now at Rewild as our Africa program director. He had described the kipunji back about 15 years ago, more than almost 20 years ago now. And he basically set it up for us to go in and for me to see that animal. And BBC actually was able to film me seeing it in the wild the first time. So it's a nice program. I should give you the link to that. But then somebody split off one of the lorises, the pygmy loris, as a separate genus of loris a couple of years ago. And there I was, still missing a genus. So I had to go to Vietnam last year. I was on a trip looking at different places in Southeast Asia, and I managed to finally get that one. So I'm back up to 83 again. So I've seen all genera of primates in the wild. With the turtles, I thought, okay, I'm never going to see all the turtles. Why don't I try to break that down a little bit and try to see as many of the genera as possible? Now, seeing Asian genera in the wild, it's pretty damn hard because they're so heavily exploited and they're so cryptic. So for now, I'm focused really on just trying to get all the Western Hemisphere genera. And right now, I've got them all except for Staurotypus and Claudius. And there are places where I know you can see them if you go out and look for them. I just haven't done it yet, but I think it's relatively straightforward if you go to the right sites to get. Then I'll have all the Western Hemisphere Chelonians. I'm definitely never going to get all of the old world ones. But then I looked again. Okay, how about all the families? And then I was missing the Pseudomedura and Keratocheles, which are two distinct families. And for my 70th birthday, I did that trip to Australia and got those. But this is not just a frivolous activity, and it's primate watching, turtle watching, whatever, is a very good way of stimulating interest among people. People love lists. I mean, I don't know if you guys follow sports, but I watch a lot of sports, and every 5 minutes there's a top 10 this, top 10 greatest plays of the day or the week, top 50 great athletes of all time, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of adopting that for watching different kinds of animals, I think is a good approach. And my oldest son, John, he's a world-class birder. He's seen close to 6,000 bird species in the wild. And I've watched how incredibly interconnected the bird watching community is. I mean, they're way ahead of the rest of us. I mean, light years ahead of us. I mean, they've got the Merlin app. They've got all sorts of different ways of putting your life lists together, and it's a globally networked community. Anytime he goes somewhere and wants to see birds, he just goes on some website, finds somebody, and they connect and they go out and see birds together. We're way behind on that with primates. We're even more behind with turtles, but there's no reason why we can't stimulate that more in the future. And a couple of American guys, I think it was probably about 4 or 5 years ago, did a big year for turtles, and saw, I think, all but 1 or 2 species of North American turtles in the wild, which was really cool. So I think this is a very good mechanism for stimulating more interest among people to go out into nature, and whether it's in a remote tropical country or in your own backyard, it's a good way for people to get more excited about biodiversity in general. And as I said, this country for turtles is #1 for turtle watching by far. So I think we should stimulate that among younger people and really get people to go out and try to see more turtles in more habitats. That was the idea behind this paper we want to do on the importance of the southeastern states, and especially Alabama and Florida, to get more people to go out there and look for turtles in the wild and get excited about them. And people love to compete. So if you make this a competitive thing, then it grows quickly.
Right. I think it's on the next generation too. It's on us to a large portion to try to figure out how to make this something that's, that, like you said, the birding community has a lot of good infrastructure, the technology behind it. If we could find a way to harness a lot of that for turtles and in other groups of animals, there's a lot of potential there. So for people listening, this is something to think about. Certainly.
Yeah. Well, you guys are probably pretty computer savvy. I'm not. I'm kind of a retard when it comes to technology, but I see the power of it. And I think that you should look at what the bird people have done and try to do something similar for turtles. You can do it globally. I mean, you've got this amazing publication led by Anders, which I'm sure you've seen, the Turtles of the World checklist. You just put that, make that an electronic version, make it possible for people to create their own life lists based on that, and you're off and running. I mean, you look at the way bird watching developed with the early field guides by Roger Torrey Peterson, I think dating back to the 1930s. That laid the groundwork for all of what's happened now. But the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology has just worked miracles with all of this. And now you can just, I don't know if you've tried to use the Merlin app, but you just take that app and you hear a bird calling and you hold it up to the sound and it identifies the bird for you. That's not going to be very helpful with turtles, but at least we can do visual identifications of the turtles. And we have the ground rules that we put together for turtle watching, which are somewhat different from those for primate watching, but basically the same concept. So I mean, if you guys can stimulate that through your podcast, and then you can do donor trips to turtle watching, take people out to the sites that you're working in and let them grow their life list by seeing the Swanee River macrocheles and whatever else you've got floating around in those rivers. But man, I mean, you want to rack up turtles, start in Texas, go through Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and panhandle of Florida, and get many of those map turtles as you can. I'm missing only one map turtle now, and it's one of the wide-ranging ones. I forget if it's Geographica or Pseudogeographica, but I've got all the others.
Wow, yeah, it is something that's if you could stimulate some competition in it, it could definitely raise some money, and it's a fun activity and get people that maybe wouldn't be interested in it through the competition aspect. So
exactly, yeah, advertise at TSA meetings like we're going to be running turtle tours. Who wants to come along?
Right.
And see if an interested turtle guy who's also a potential donor doesn't come out of the woodwork. That's how you do it.
Right. Yeah. We will take that to heart. Well, as we're starting to there's some kind of miscellaneous questions that don't fit anywhere, but that we're always just curious in as turtle people interested in turtles and such. The one that always stands out, we've asked a lot of people, is trips with Peter Pritchard. I mean, and memorable moments from that. Probably the greatest turtle man of all time, and curious what your experience with him was.
Well, Peter is one of my great friends and heroes. I mean, I obviously, like everybody else, when he came out with his Living Turtles of the World book in 1967, that rapidly became my Bible, as it has been for so many other people. And my first encounter with Peter, because I corresponded with him, I still have a thick correspondence file with him. I was at grad school. I was living in a dorm in graduate school at Harvard. And one day I'm sleeping. I worked really late hours and would sleep until about noon. And one day I'm lying there in my cramped little dorm room and somebody knocks on the door and I get up and there's this giant of a man standing outside my door. It was Peter. And I said, holy shit, and we went out. We had dinner together and hung out. And he was just a wonderful guy, great storyteller, just a real gentleman. And I loved every moment that I spent with him. The highlight in terms of trips, as with Anders, who went with him to the Galapagos early on, I also did a Galapagos trip with him to Duncan for the saddlebacks, and also to Isabella to climb Volcan Alcedo. And I had all my kids with me. I had my two boys and my daughter with me. My daughter had her, I think she had the same birthday as Peter, and they celebrated their birthday together on that trip. And my daughter was pretty tiny. I think she turned 7 on that trip. And climbing up Alcedo, I mean, if you've been to Galapagos, maybe you've been on Alcedo, it's a tough climb. And Peter carried her on his shoulders, halfway up the mountain. And we had a great time up there, seeing the tortoises sitting in those pools on the rim of Alcedo, and the Duncan saddlebacks, man. We climb up the hill and you start coming down into a valley where they're sitting in puddles. I mean, there's ever a Jurassic Park moment, it's that. I mean, Duncan is just a fantastic island, and not many people get to go there because it's off limits. But I've been fortunate. I've been there now 3 times actually, and I love the saddlebacks. I think they're the coolest of all the giant tortoises. And I've done other shorter trips with Peter. We were together at a bunch of meetings. I know we did a trip to Malaysia back in I think it was 81, where we went out and saw the breeding, the captive breeding facility for Badagur, which was being run by Ed Mole at that time. Ed Mole, have you interviewed Ed Mole yet?
Not yet, but he's certainly on the list.
Ed and Don Mole, I mean, they're really key guys. And Ed, with the whole origin of I should go a little bit into this, the whole origin of the tortoise and freshwater turtle specialist group. Ed and I met at a meeting of the IUCN Species Survival Commission in 1979 in Gainesville, by the way. And we talked about the fact that there was a marine turtle specialist group, one of the oldest specialist groups in the IUCN network, but there wasn't a group specific to the freshwater turtles and tortoises. And Ian Swingland at that time was interested in doing something on the tortoises. And I talked to Ed Mull about, why don't you do something on the freshwater turtles as well? And he took that on, and later, a short time later, the two merged, and Peter became the first chair of the combined group. There's a very good timeline in the Turtles in Danger. I think it was the 2018 version, the top 25, Turtles in Trouble.
Turtles in Trouble.
Yeah, you should look at that timeline, and we're going to update that a little bit. There's some pieces that are missing, but it's very interesting because just today, I sent a message to Rene Honegger. You probably haven't heard of him. He's a Swiss herpetologist who, going back to the 1960s, was the first chair of the combined reptile and amphibian specialist group of IUCN. There was a marine turtle group and a crocodile group very early on. A little bit later, there was an iguana group. And then eventually in the late 70s, early 80s, we got the tortoise and freshwater turtle group together. But all the other herps were included in this global reptile and amphibian group for a long time. And I just got the history of it from Rene this morning. He must be well into his 80s, but he very kindly sent me a detailed review of the history of it, which is very, very nice to have. But yeah, so Ed is a key figure. His brother Don also very key figures in the early days of the specialist group, and also in very high quality research on a number of turtle species around the world.
Kind of like, not meaning to interject here, but going back to what you're saying about Duncan Island and the Galapagos, there's nowhere in the world I want to go more than there. I'm infatuated with the saddleback tortoises of the Galapagos. They're my favorite living creatures. Like, I remember I've read everything about them that I possibly could. I was so sad that I could not, there's no way I could get there, like having no connections and just being a student, go visiting the Galapagos. So that is like my ultimate like dream place. When you went there, you said, how many of those old tortoises did you see, of like the native ones? Did you see a good amount of them, or was it like there were only a handful left?
No, on that first trip, I'd say we saw several dozen. On this more recent trip, I'd say we this most recent trip, 2 trips actually over the course of several days, we helicoptered in. And we didn't spend a lot of time there because we were with Leonardo DiCaprio and he had a tight schedule.
Yeah.
But I think on this last one, we probably saw about 6 or 8. And then we released a bunch of them.
Yeah.
We did a release. Which was pretty cool. One's about this big that have been raised in captivity. But yeah, they're cool. And look, we have a big program in the Galapagos, and one of our staff members is Carl Campbell. Yeah. Who's been just a major force for invasive species removal there for about 25 years. And he's based in Santa Cruz. So if you ever go back there, you want to go back there, I'm sure you will, let me know and we'll see if he can arrange a visit. Duncan is not far from Santa Cruz, right?
Yeah.
It's quite close. It's not like one of the remote areas like Wolf or Darwin. It's physically it's close, but it's been very much controlled, and I think appropriately so, because you don't want too many tourists running around. You might even want to interview Carl at some point. He's not a turtle biologist per se, but what he's done to remove invasive species and facilitate the comeback for many Galapagos tortoises is just amazing. I mean, he's been the key figure, I think, in Galapagos tortoise conservation and terrestrial Galapagos conservation overall. And as I said, he works for us at Rewild.
That would be great. Yeah, I mean, we focus on turtles, but global conservation, anything related to science and and sort of biodiversity is interesting. So that would be great. But yeah, in terms of some of the largest, your perspective, having seen a lot of changes in habitat over time from a conservation perspective, what do you think right now in the 21st century and in this year and going forward are the biggest issues for biodiversity and turtles, and can we fix these things?
Well, there are a lot of challenges. I mean, I am an eternal optimist, and if you're not an optimist, you shouldn't be in this business, because you have to have some hope for the future. Because if you don't have hope, then you're just going to be constantly frustrated. So you have to take really appreciate your successes and don't get too down when you have setbacks or you hit obstacles. I don't believe in long-term failures, but you do have obstacles, and lots of them these days. And I think over the course of your lifetimes, you're going to see a lot more change, and a lot of it's not going to be so much for the better. I mean, one of the big challenges is getting a broader segment of the population globally and in this country more interested in biodiversity conservation. Climate change is a big issue now. And, 25 years ago, when climate change was really starting to emerge as an issue, I thought, this is really good, but it's going to swamp biodiversity conservation. And it has. It's really, most of the people who have some environmental inclinations are mostly focused on climate. Rightly so. I mean, climate change could negate a lot of what we're doing in terms of biodiversity conservation, but we can't not do species conservation, for example, because of the potential looming threat of, or the actual threat of climate change. So I'd like to see more of an appreciation for why saving other species, why saving life on Earth is fundamentally important to us. It's easy to ignore it because there's always another major crisis emerging. Ukraine, Gaza, and Israel, eventually Taiwan. There's always something that, Trump and the elections coming up, and there's always something that distracts you. But how do we become more effective in demonstrating that these environmental issues, and specifically biodiversity conservation, are fundamentally important to the survival of the planet and to our own survival as well? And look, as I said, I've been doing this for 55 years now, and I wish I had a silver bullet, but I don't. And I keep, chugging along, trying to demonstrate in one way or another, in one place or another, that certain things work, and trying to scale them up as much as possible to other places. But you guys are the future, and the fact that, you're already so advanced in your careers, you're already doing this sort of thing, which, was unimaginable for me at the same age you are. This is terrific, and I think you should just keep on doing what you're doing. Use social media much more to good effect, and take on leadership roles. You guys are already leaders, but you really, I think, are well positioned to become even bigger leaders in conservation in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's tough footsteps to fill for sure. I mean, I don't think, if we can even do half of what you and the people before us have done, it will be a huge for us. But yeah, thank you for the kind words.
I think you'll do more.
Well, we'll certainly try. It's
you'll do more. You got a lot of time.
Yeah. Well, a few more things just to sort of wrap up here, and kind of broader philosophical takeaways and such. But I'm curious always, you've been in this for decades, and going into it, you probably have some ideas about conservation that have changed. What's been the biggest, how has your conservation philosophy changed? We talked a little bit about that early on with your idea of sustainable harvest, but at a broad scale, the efficacy of doing conservation, has that changed over time?
Well, look, I've always been a species conservation guy, focused on certain groups of organisms, but my focus has always been species conservation in the wild, because I believe that species conservation is fundamental to all global conservation efforts. And people get, really focused on other things: ecosystem conservation, ecological processes, major drivers of destruction. All of that stuff is important. But ultimately, if we don't protect the species and don't come up with mechanisms for the species that are the building blocks of the ecosystems that provide the ecosystem services, otherwise, if we don't do that, we're going to fail over the long term, I think. And there's a lot of discussion about and a lot of money spent on tackling the drivers of destruction, of biodiversity loss, which is really, really important. Like, the fact that agro-industry is the biggest source of destruction of biodiversity globally. And, you go to a place like the Amazon, it's cattle and soy. And you go to Southeast Asia and it's oil palm. I mean, large portions of these high priority areas in Southeast Asia, like Malaysia and Indonesia, are oil palm. And this is number one. Then you've got logging and you've got mining and, logging of tropical forests, of primary tropical forests for timber is a 19th century activity that does not belong in the 21st century. And yet it continues. These forests are worth so much more than cutting them down just to take out some logs. So these sorts of things, we need to change the mindset and really recognize the value of these natural ecosystems for everything that they contain, everything that they provide for us. And I think that is a huge education process through which we can get a message across using social media at a scale that was never before possible. But you got a lot of other noises out there that you need to compete with to get these messages across. I mean, if you want to take it back to turtles, I mean, I've been pushing the idea for a long time of turtles and tortoises as providers of ecosystem services, because the ecosystem services issue is a big one. But if you look at turtles as pristine densities, you look at some of the early records of people coming into the Caribbean in the 1600s and the 1700s, very often they couldn't get their boats to shore because there were so many marine turtles. If you look at the accounts from Bates and Wallace and others of the Potoc river turtles in the Amazon, they were enormously abundant. The harvest of eggs was what provided the oil so they could light their houses and light their streets in the 1800s. The crocodile, the black caimans were incredibly diverse and incredibly dense at the mouth of the Amazon. And these are major nutrient recycling animals. The tortoises on the islands, the Galapagos and the Indian Ocean islands, just enormous numbers of tortoises. And if you could bring these animals up to at least something approximating the original densities, they're very important nutrient cyclers, and they also are carbon sinks in certain ways. They're long-lived animals like trees, right? They live a very long time. They live longer than some trees, and they sequester a lot of carbon. This is now being looked at for whales and elephants and some of these other large mammals in a process called animating the carbon cycle, which is something that you should look at. But a lot of these reptiles are also potential carbon sinks. So looking at all these different services that turtles and tortoises provide, I think we can come up with some cogent arguments for why they can be conserved, not just because they're cool and we love them, but also because they have very key roles in ecosystems. So these are things that I think you guys, with your social media skills, can help to promote at a scale that goes way beyond anything that, my generation, hell, I'm 2 generations removed from you guys. You could be my grandchildren. I think you have a capacity now to influence and get messages out there that we never had.
Right. I feel like the concept of the option value concept, kind of, if you can quantify the impact that an organism or a habitat has for the global ecosystem is a really strong thing. It needs to be communicated more efficiently, and there's a lot of, like you say, a lot of opportunity for that.
Yeah. And when you see turtles at pristine densities, which I've seen in a few places, like in parts of the Llanos of Venezuela, with the Potoc vogli, it's just staggering how many turtles you see in one place. And the Galapagos are coming back. You were on Santa Cruz a few years ago. I mean, I counted, like, I think driving up from the capital, what's the name of it? Puerto Ayora, up to the sites where you can see some of these breeding stations for the for the Galapagos. I counted like 150 Galapagos tortoises.
More than that.
And when I first went there, probably 20 plus years ago, you didn't see that many. So they're coming back really fast.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that area has been, it seems like it's on a positive trajectory, certainly the past 22 decades or so, for sure. So something more on the human side of things. You've mentioned your interest in cultures and such. Have you noticed anything? Because you've been to more than half of the recognized countries easily. And have you noticed anything about the human condition that is consistent or universal, or is it all just different? And is that the beauty of it?
Well, we're all in many ways the same, but what I've always found fascinating is the cultural differences that exist, whether they're linguistic differences, whether they're cultural practices that are different. I'm particularly fond of indigenous people, and I've spent a lot of time with Amazonian tribes. I've worked with the Trio Indians in southern Suriname for, what is it now, almost 30 years, and many other tribes in Amazonia. And I really appreciate their closeness to nature and how they manage to survive in what are sometimes very trying conditions. And so humans are extremely adaptable and capable of adjusting to many different changes and many conditions of the environment. But, we have to be even more adaptable now because a lot of things are changing in a lot of different parts of the world. We're fortunate in this country in that we're buffered from a lot of the negative impacts of biodiversity loss and climate change. That's not true in different parts of the world. So, but I've always found cultural diversity extremely fascinating. And we did a study a while back that you might be interested in. We looked at linguistic diversity as a surrogate for cultural diversity, because each language has its own worldview and its own context. And we found that of the 6,000 plus languages that are still spoken on the planet, between the hotspots and the high biodiversity wilderness areas, about 75% of the languages that were still spoken were found in these high priority areas for biodiversity. A very heavy portion of them in Melanesia, especially the island of New Guinea. Melanesia's got about 1,000 languages that are still spoken. But so there's a real win-win situation working with these cultures, and the great cultural diversity exists, and trying to maintain biodiversity. And in fact, many of the endangered cultures, cultures and the languages that are spoken by only a few dozen or a few hundred people, are also found in the areas where a lot of the species that are critically endangered are found. So there's a good opportunity for win-win situations working with these local peoples, these local communities, indigenous peoples, and trying to conserve biodiversity at the same time. And this is something we're really big into now in Amazonia in particular.
It's fascinating. It makes sense. It's sort of subject to the same sort of constraints and natural selection that non-human animals are subject to in a lot of ways. So it would shape that, and you'd expect to see kind of high diversity in those high diversity areas. It's interesting.
Yeah.
So
that's another cool place to get to. New Guinea is just unbelievably culturally diverse. It's just fabulous, and it has a fair number of turtles, although it's not easy to find them there.
And it was interesting hearing Dr. Radin talk about it too, how he would do medical work there, and in his free time go and look for turtles. It's like,
yeah. No, he's done a lot. He's described, I think, at least 2, maybe 3 species from New Guinea. But yeah, I've been there now about a dozen times, and it's extremely fascinating culturally. It's also a little scary because you never know what's going to happen. So,
right. In terms of your most memorable moments, and what would you say is your most memorable trip and most memorable speech or keynote kind of address, and why?
Well, my most memorable trip to this day, I think, has to be that 4-month Amazonian expedition in '73. I look back on that and I think that was so much fun and so key to the future of my career. I've given lots of speeches. I mean, I really liked the very short speech that I gave when I won the Indianapolis Prize back in 2018. The host for that was Harrison Ford, who I knew very well, of course, from Conservation International, where he was a board member while I was president there. And he very kindly agreed to be the MC of that event, the Indianapolis Prize. And we had a really great audience, a really receptive audience. And the other finalists were close friends, and yeah, I really enjoyed that having the opportunity to give that speech and how well received it was by so many people. There was one very short speech that I gave once in New Guinea. Actually, there's an event called the Highlands Show. It happens twice a year, one in the Highlands areas, one in Mount Hagen and the other one in Goroka. And you get 80 or 90 cultures from around the country, basically performing in their traditional outfits, which are feather headdresses, tree kangaroo skins, you name it. I mean, just most unbelievable cultural phenomenon I've ever seen. And at the end of it, I went up to the guy who was organizing it, and I said, "This is really the best cultural performance I've ever seen." He said, "Here's the mic. Why don't you go and say this to 30,000 people who were present?" So I got up and I said, "Hey, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen." And I talked for a few minutes, and that's the biggest audience I've ever spoken to in a public setting. Not quite conservation oriented, but certainly very much focused on indigenous people.
That's fascinating. That's fun. That's all of the sort of unexpected moments too, right? That's a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, unplanned.
Right. And so your kids, you've mentioned a bit, have sort of followed in your footsteps in some ways, and that's been interesting. What has it been like to see how they've sort of taken after what you've done and created their own paths?
Well, it's very gratifying. I mean, I know they hate it when somebody says they're following my footsteps, but basically, in many ways, they have. But you know what I did with them when they were really little is I would always expose them to animals. I always had reptiles and amphibians. I'm not much of a dog or cat person, but I always had reptiles and amphibians in a greenhouse or in the house itself. And so they always handled or saw turtles in particular, snakes, lizards, whatever. At one point, we'd have like 50 or 60 different herps in the greenhouse. And so they always were exposed to these animals. And my oldest son, John, who now is the director of threatened species outreach for the American Bird Conservancy here in Washington, he, at about age 10 or 11, on a trip to East Africa with his grandparents, he suddenly got interested in birds. He was first herps, but then he really got interested in birds and just went crazy on the birds and has been doing that ever since. My other son, Mickey, who you know, he also started with herps, and then about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little longer, he started going crazy on plants, especially aroid plants like monstera and philodendron. But he still keeps a very strong love of tortoises. He's just crazy about tortoises, and especially redfoot tortoises. But what I did with them is I always not just expose them to the animals at home, but also take them on trips. Whenever I could manage it, I take one or another of them or all of them along on a trip somewhere. So they all got to go to tropical forests. I think John went for the first time at age 2, Mickey and Juliana probably at age 4. And they've just been able to go from time to time, really just about every year they get to do one trip or another. So they've been exposed very early on to the rest of the world, and you know, realizing that the whole world is not just the United States. There are many different situations, cultural contexts, biodiversity of different kinds. So they've really had a good opportunity to see a big piece of the world. And Juliana became the youngest. At age 12, she hit all 7 continents when we went to Antarctica. So she holds that record.
Wow. That is incredible to have that kind of upbringing. You know, it's so unique when you introduce yourself to someone. I've been to over 100 countries. You know, it's so.
Yeah, no. John is on a track to catch me fairly soon. Right now, he was just in Argentina for a couple of months. Now he's going to Colombia, and he'll be back here in a few weeks. He's very strongly focused on the lost species search. I mean, he's developed a whole program for looking for lost species of birds, and Rewild has a lost species program in general, where every year or so we find some new species, some species that hasn't been seen in decades or centuries. John rediscovered a bird in Papua New Guinea, one of the islands off the east coast of Papua New Guinea, a bird that was known from two specimens first described in 1882 and never seen again, and he rediscovered it in 2022.
Wow, that's it's cool. It's running in the family. That's cool to see. The generational, and it's carrying over, and in different ways. It's they're following in footsteps, but also creating their own paths, which is really cool. Well, our
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say they're way ahead of me already, so it's gratifying to see that.
Well, our last question that we typically get to is it's one that's kind of standardized, but if you got one piece of advice, and it can be more than one if you want, but just that you would give to someone looking to make conservation or turtle conservation part of a career, what would it be?
Well, recognize that you're probably not going to get rich. It's not something that pays very well if you go into the NGO conservation business, but it's extremely gratifying. And Anders followed a very interesting path in that he became both an orthopedic surgeon and a turtle expert, a leader in turtle research and conservation. That's hard to do. If you somehow can find a career that enables you to earn and become financially independent, while at the same time doing your studies of turtles, so much the better. But most people aren't able to do that. So what I always say, and I think that's a message you'll hear from many senior people in this business, is follow your heart. Do what you really love. Don't do a job that you hate, or don't do a job just to earn money. Just do what makes you happy, because you only live once, and you want to have a career that's gratifying and where you feel that you've actually accomplished something at the end of the day.
Right. Well, we will take that to heart, and for people listening, that's advice that is just, thank you for that. And so we're sort of, unless anyone else has anything to say, I think we can kind of wrap things up. But we do like to do at the end of these. I didn't mention this. I like to say in the beginning, but I've forgotten for the past year or so. So I'll just give it up. But we like to do a little round of turtle trivia. So if you have a few random obscure turtle facts that you want to throw at us, we can do a round. We could throw some at you if you want, and we can just test each other's turtle knowledge in a.
Oh, good. Better throw some at me, but my turtle knowledge is not what it used to be, but go give it a try.
Okay. Do you guys, I've got a question. If you guys want to go, Jack, you're muted, I think. Oh, did I?
I muted myself earlier. I'll let you go. Hold on. I'm still thinking.
All right. This one is, well, it's related to something we talked about, but so the graptomes, the map turtles, it's a fairly straightforward one. How many species are in that genus, or recognize the typically cited number, I guess?
Oh, God, I should know because I've seen almost all of them. What are we up to now? I think it's about 16 or 17.
I think in Peter Lindemann's book, he says 14, but that could, I mean, if we counted them all out, that's close enough that it's, I think.
Yeah, I'll pull the checklist off my shelf here. And
Okay.
count them. But, I've made a point of trying to see all of them. And as I say, I keep forgetting whether it's Pseudogeographica or Geographica, the most wide-ranging one that's more to the north. That's the only one I haven't seen.
Okay. Yeah. I think, Pseudogeographica, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it.
All right. Wyatt's got something.
I kind of had this one in mind since before, when I think Michael kind of stole it. I was gonna ask how many species are in the genus Podocnus.
Oh, the genus, not the Podocnemini.
Yeah, genus.
You've got Expansa, Sextuberculata, Uniphilus, Leviana, Vogli, and Erythrocephala.
Yep.
6. Then you've got Erythrocheles, and you've got
Yep.
Peltocephalus. And then you got a bunch of fossils.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
That's an easy one.
Cool. All right.
So I got a question for you guys.
Oh,
I mean, you asked me why I'm interested in turtles. I mean, why are you interested in turtles?
Ooh. I don't know. It's just kind of like,
Did you start like, as a child, or did you were a late bloomer?
Well,
so to speak?
I started for me. I worked with Audubon for 10 years, from 5 to 15, and
My
yeah.
God.
So I originally started off with birds, but as I grew older, when I was around 11 and up, I started to counsel for the younger groups of like the 5 to 6 year olds, and in our garden classroom we had a couple turtles. We had a diamondback terrapin, we had a red-eared slider, an eastern mud turtle, and a box turtle, and I would routinely, clean their enclosures, feed them, do all the maintenance for that. And that's kind of what got me infatuated with turtles in the first place. Just seeing their personalities and just how beautiful they are and how interesting they are with their behaviors.
Wow, good for you, God. You guys started early, man. 5 to 15. That's pretty incredible. And you went in the other direction, birds to turtles. It's
Yeah.
good for you.
I know, speaking for me, I've just been like laser focused ever since I was a little kid. When I was a little kid, it was like reptiles in general that I was just super. As time went on, especially after I got like pet red-eared sliders and everything, red-eared sliders always like involved in those stories. Turtles
What was there?
it just became obvious that turtles are the best, and they're just the best ones that there are. And I've just focused like solely on turtles for as long as I've been around now. So just, gotten involved in everything that you can think of
That's very much like me. I mean, I started with all of them. I especially liked snakes, but then I just drifted more and more to turtles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mine was just in first grade. I just picked up a little book and kind of got through it, actually through the literature end of it to begin with. And I early on, a lot of Christmas presents in 4th and 5th grade, I'd get these scientific manuals, and I think a lot of my teachers kind of worried about me. I'd come to the reading day with the research methods for turtles and such. And like early on, the in-text citations, this is interesting. And I saw these names and then started emailing people. And actually it was funny when I contacted Dr. Odin about doing the podcast episode. I realized I'd sent him an email about 10 years ago that was just this like 5th grader reaching out to see if there was an internship or something. And it was just, but yeah, that's kind of how it started, and I did a research project with the Southwestern pond turtles behind my elementary school that I've taken to college. And it's just, it continues to grow. All these different sub passions come off of it, and it's, but just kind of early on through books and then the field part of it. And it's just, it keeps getting more enriching and interesting.
You're all early bloomers, like me. So where are you guys all from? You're from California, right, Michael?
Then Wyatt and I are both from Delaware. So
Delaware.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're up.
So I'm not a fan of the cold, and there's not as much turtle research opportunities or just in general up there. Even though I am working with turtles up there, it's just I go back to the summer now.
Are there any bog turtles there?
There are, few populations.
Yeah.
So my research has been on striped mud turtles there. So Delaware's the northern edge of the striped mud turtles range. So
you got striped muds there.
Yeah, they go all the way up the coastal plain up into Delaware. It was like 2018 or so is when genetic work proved that they were striped mud turtles, but morphologically it's the same thing. They're striped muds. So it was really cryptic, really cool.
Yeah, the regular mud, the common mud is hard to find. I haven't seen a common mud in the wild. I've seen stripes many times, but I haven't seen.
You haven't seen? Well, those are we have those.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we have tons of them, and we also have a lot of northern red-bellied cooters up here, and I'm actually writing a book on them right now.
Really?
Yeah, about their natural history and ecology.
God, you guys are writing books already. That's impressive. Good for you.
Well,
you got to give me some sites for mud turtles in Delaware.
Yeah, that's
bugs me that I haven't seen them. I've seen many stink pots because we used to collect them on Long Island, but never a mud.
There's some good places for them, and even places where wild ones have been kind of accustomed to people feeding them, which is really unusual for kind of sternids. So you'll see eastern muds if you're lucky. Come up and take like food from people it's a footbridge in Delaware. That's like pretty.
Oh, send me that information. That'd be great.
Yeah.
I'm always looking to add to my turtle life list because it's highly competitive now. There's a bunch of us that are about 125 species, and we're always trying to beat the other guy.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Well, if you're ever up in Delaware, we'd be happy to show you.
Yeah.
Sounds great. Sounds good. Not that far from where I am. So.
No, yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much. I mean, this has been an incredible opportunity to sit down with you and just talk about sort of all of your work. It's inspired all of us really immensely, and it's just an honor to sit down with you. Thank you.
Let me know if you guys want some books. Just send me your mailing addresses, and if you got my list of stuff. So if there's anything there that you see that's interesting, let me know. Just send me your email at your mailing addresses, and we'll send you some stuff.
All right. We will sign.
Are you going to run this? Are you going to run this whole thing?
We will. I may make it a two-parter. We've got a few that go to the 3-hour mark. We sat down with Sybil Pritchard recently, and that one went about 3 hours.
I can imagine.
But it may be two.
That's great.
But yeah, I mean, if anyone has last things to say, or if not,
I think we're good.
And when do you think this will run?
I'll probably put it out in a few months. There's a backlog of a few of them, but yeah, this will probably be the start of the season 3. So
okay,
should be a while.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I will.
Mickey will be dying to listen to it. I know.
All right. Yeah, no, this is going to be really exciting, and we will see everyone on the next one.